Tonight we're wandering down into the old Greek underworld of stories, that dim borderland where gods lean too close to mortals and everything they touch takes on a permanent, low-grade tragedy. It is a world run almost entirely by beings with unlimited power and the emotional regulation of a hungry toddler, and we are going to spend the next couple of hours among the people who got caught in the fallout. Before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy sad old stories told gently in the dark, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Dim or turn off the lights. Get comfortable. Have you ever wondered why a man would be given fruit and water he could never quite reach? Why a woman would rather turn to stone than keep feeling what she was feeling? What it actually meant to be loved by a god? And why that was almost always the worst thing that could happen to you? Why one boy flew too high and another drove a chariot he had no business steering? Why a mother of 14 ended up as a weeping rock on a mountainside? And why the Greeks found that comforting rather than horrifying? Who Sisyphus was before the boulder? And why, in nearly every one of these stories, the cruelty isn't random at all, but follows a strict and almost bureaucratic logic that the Greeks understood in their bones. We'll get to all of them. Slowly, there's no hurry down here. The dead have all the time in the world. Let's begin somewhere warm and doomed, the man who fed the gods the wrong dinner. You've just woken up as a guest at the finest table in the ancient world, and the host is a king named Tantalus. He is fabulously wealthy, he is a son of Zeus, and he has done something no other mortal has managed before or since. He has been invited to eat with the gods themselves up on Olympus as an equal. The nectar is real. The ambrosia is real. The company is the most powerful in the universe, and Tantalus is sitting right in the middle of it, being served the food of immortality like he belongs there. This is the part of the story where a wiser man would simply eat his dinner and go home. Tantalus was not a wiser man. Tantalus was a man who had been given the single greatest honour available to a mortal, and immediately began to wonder what he could get away with. He started small, by the standards of what came later. He pocketed some of the divine food to smuggle back down to his friends, which is roughly the mythological equivalent of stealing office supplies, except the office belongs to the immortal rulers of reality, and the supplies grant eternal life. Then he began repeating what he'd heard at the table, the private conversations of gods, carried back down the mountain like the world's most dangerous gossip. And then he decided to test them. This is the thing about Tantalus that the Greeks kept coming back to, generation after generation. He had proof that the gods were real. He had eaten with them. And still some restless, corroded part of him needed to know whether they were as all-knowing as they claimed. So he devised a test, and the test was monstrous, and we are going to move through it gently, because the details are grim and you are trying to fall asleep. He prepared a great feast for the gods in return, to repay their hospitality. And into that feast, disguised among the dishes, he served the remains of his own son, a boy named Pelops, to see whether the gods would notice what they were eating. They noticed immediately. Every single one of them stopped, appalled, and would not touch the food. Every one except Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, who was so deep in her own grief over her missing daughter that she wasn't paying attention, and absent-mindedly ate a piece of the boy's shoulder before she realized. The gods, horrified, put the child back together, restored him to life, and gave him a small ivory replacement for the shoulder that was gone. Pelops lived. He went on to have his own complicated life and his own cursed descendants, which we'll get to, because in Greek myth the misery is hereditary and beautifully organised. But Tantalus they took care of personally. They sent him down to the underworld and placed him in a pool of clear, cool water that came up to his chin. Above him hung branches heavy with ripe fruit, pears and figs and pomegranates, close enough to brush his forehead. And there he was left, forever hungry and forever thirsty, standing in water he could not drink, and beneath fruit he could not eat. Every time he bent his head to sip, the water drained away into the earth. Every time he reached up for the fruit, the wind lifted the branches just out of his grasp. Always close. Never enough. This is where we get the word tantalize, from a man reaching for something that pulls away the instant before he touches it, for the rest of time. It's a strangely quiet punishment when you sit with it. No fire, no torment you could point to. Just proximity to everything he wanted and permanent exclusion from all of it. The Greeks understood that the cruelest thing you can do to a person isn't to deny them the good things. It's to hang the good things an inch from their mouth and let them keep trying. There's a small telling detail in some tellings. The reason the gods chose water and fruit specifically, rather than fire or chains, is that Tantalus's original sin was greed at the table. He wanted more than his share of the divine feast. So they gave him an eternal table and set an eternal feast in front of him and let him starve at it. The punishment is just the crime, handed back forever. The Greeks loved that kind of symmetry. You'll see it again tonight. You'll see it a lot. And somewhere up above, his patched-up son Pelops was already growing into a young man whose own family line would become the most catastrophically unlucky household in all of mythology. But that's a story for a little later, when we've settled in a bit more. For now, just picture the water pulling away. Picture the branches lifting. And picture the man who had everything, standing forever in the middle of everything, unable to take a single bite. The king who cheated the ferryman. Now meet a man who looked at the entire machinery of the afterlife, the gods, the underworld, the inevitability of the end, and decided the rules simply did not apply to him. His name was Sisyphus, and he was the king of a city that would later be called Corinth. He was clever. Not wise, clever, which in Greek myth is a very different and much more dangerous thing to be. Wisdom keeps you humble. Cleverness gives you just enough rope to strangle yourself with over the course of several increasingly ambitious schemes. Sisyphus had cleverness in enormous supply, and not 1 gram of the humility that should have come with it. He started by being a bad host in an age when hospitality was sacred. He was said to have harmed travellers and guests who came through his kingdom, which broke one of the oldest and most serious rules the Greeks had. The rule that a stranger at your door might be a god in disguise and should be treated accordingly. But that was only the warm-up. The real trouble began when Sisyphus saw something he wasn't supposed to see. He witnessed Zeus carrying off a young woman, and when the girl's father came searching, frantic, Sisyphus made a deal. He would tell the father exactly where his daughter had been taken, in exchange for a fresh spring of water for his city. He informed on the king of the gods. He sold divine gossip for municipal infrastructure. And Zeus, who did not appreciate being reported like a noise complaint, decided that Sisyphus's time among the living was over. Here is where Sisyphus earns his place in this story. When the figure came to escort him down to the underworld, a grim being sent to bind him and lead him below, Sisyphus did something no one had ever thought to try. He asked with great curiosity and apparent innocence how the shackles worked. Would his escort mind demonstrating? Just so he understood. And the escort, flattered or bored, or simply not expecting a mortal to be this brazen, put the shackles on to show him, and Sisyphus snapped them shut and left his own escort chained up in a closet. The consequence of this was chaos. With the one who ferries the departed now locked away, no one could pass on. No one could reach the underworld at all. The natural order of endings simply stopped working. The old and the sick and those whose time had come lingered on, unable to move to the next place, and the whole cosmic system began to back up like a drain. It took the god of war himself to come storming down, free the trapped escort, and personally deliver Sisyphus to the underworld where he was supposed to be. And even then, Sisyphus wasn't finished. Before he was taken, he had quietly instructed his wife to do something improper with his remains, to leave certain funeral rites undone. So when he arrived in the underworld, he was able to complain, bitterly and convincingly, that his wife had failed to honour him properly. He begged the queen of the underworld for permission to go back up, just briefly, just long enough to scold his wife and set things right. Permission granted, and Sisyphus, naturally, had no intention of returning. He went back to the land of the living, to sunlight and warm food and his own bed, and simply resumed being alive, having talked his way out of the afterlife not once but twice. They had to come and get him a final time. And when they did, the gods had finally had enough of his cleverness, so they designed a punishment that cleverness could never solve. You know this one, even if you've never heard the rest of it. They gave him a boulder and a hill. His task was to roll the boulder up to the top of the hill. That was all. A simple, honest labour. Except that the moment he neared the summit, the boulder would roll back down to the bottom, and he would have to begin again. Forever, no trick would work. No deal could be struck, no shackle could be demonstrated, no wife could be blamed. Just a stone, and a slope, and a man who was too clever to ever be allowed to rest. The Greeks chose this punishment on purpose, and the purpose is quietly devastating. Sisyphus's whole life had been about outcomes, about winning, about beating the system and getting the result he wanted. So they gave him a task with no outcome at all. Pure effort, endlessly achieving nothing. The one thing his cleverness couldn't touch was a job that was never meant to be finished. Much later, a French writer would look at this image, the man and the stone and the hill, and decide that Sisyphus was actually the happiest man in the world, because in a life without meaning, the struggle itself could be enough. That's a lovely thought, and we can borrow it for comfort tonight if we like. But the Greeks who first told this story didn't mean it as comfort. They meant it as a warning about what happens to a man who thinks he's smarter than the end of things. Somewhere down there the stone is still rolling back down, and a clever king is walking down after it, again to begin. The one who stole fire. Not every soul suffering in the deep places did something to deserve it. Some of them suffered precisely because they were kind, and tonight we come to the kindest of them all, chained to a rock at the edge of the world for the crime of caring too much about people who couldn't defend themselves. His name was Prometheus, and he wasn't a man. He was a Titan, one of the older generation of divine beings that came before the Olympian gods. And when the great war between the old gods and the new gods broke out, Prometheus had the foresight to pick the winning side. His name means forethought. He could see how things would turn out before they did, which made his eventual fate all the more poignant, because he chose it anyway, knowing exactly what it would cost him. After the war, the world was young and needed populating, and the job of making the creatures fell partly to Prometheus and his less thoughtful brother. His brother, whose name essentially means afterthought, went first, and cheerfully handed out all the good survival gifts to the animals: claws, fur, speed, sharp teeth, wings, thick hides. He was generous and enthusiastic and completely without a plan, and by the time they got around to making humans, every good quality had already been given away. Humanity arrived last, and arrived with nothing. No fur against the cold, no claws, no fangs, no natural armour. Just soft, shivering, upright things blinking in a world full of better-equipped animals. Prometheus looked at these naked, defenceless creatures and felt something the other gods mostly didn't feel, which was tenderness. He took a liking to humans. He wanted them to survive. And so he began to help them, quietly, in ways that would eventually put him at odds with the king of the gods himself. There was already tension over how much humans should be giving back to the gods in sacrifice, and Prometheus, ever the trickster on humanity's behalf, arranged a clever deal that let people keep the good, nourishing parts of their animals for themselves, while offering the gods the parts they couldn't eat, dressed up to look appealing. Zeus saw through it, and was not amused, and in his anger he took fire away from humanity altogether. Let them stay warm-blooded and clever with no way to cook, no way to warm themselves, no light against the dark. Let them shiver in it. Prometheus could not leave them like that. So he did the thing he is remembered for. He went and took fire, some say from the workshop of the smith god, some say from the sun itself, and he hid a burning ember inside a hollow stalk of fennel, and he carried it down the mountain and gave it back to the people. He gave them warmth. He gave them cooked food and forged tools and light in the darkness and everything that flows from those things, which is to say he gave them civilization, smuggled down in a plant stem like a lit cigarette hidden up a sleeve. Zeus was furious in the way that only a god who has been publicly outmaneuvered can be. And the punishment he devised for Prometheus was one of the most enduring images of suffering in all of mythology. He had Prometheus taken to the far edge of the world, to a lonely mountain crag, and chained there against the bare rock, unable to move, exposed to every extreme of heat and cold. And each day an eagle would come, the personal bird of Zeus, and feed upon his liver. And each night, because Prometheus was immortal and could not be released by the end that releases everyone else, his liver would grow back whole, so that the eagle could return the next morning and begin again, day after day. The same wound, the same bird, the same dawn. Forever, as far as anyone knew. Sit with the particular cruelty of that design. It isn't just pain. It's pain plus recovery plus the certainty of the pain returning, which is a much more sophisticated torment than pain alone. The Greeks understood that hope in the right circumstances is its own kind of suffering. Every night Prometheus healed. Every night, for a few hours, his body was whole again, and every morning the eagle came back. What makes it land, though, is why he was up there. He wasn't punished for pride like Tantalus or for cheating like Sisyphus. He was punished for compassion. He looked at the weakest, most helpless creatures in the world and decided they deserved a chance. And he paid for that decision with an eternity of daily agony. And here is the part the Greeks never let you forget. He knew he would. His name means forethought. He saw the eagle coming before he ever picked up the fire. And he picked it up anyway. There's a version of the ending, much later, where a great hero passes by that lonely crag on his travels and, with a single well-aimed shot, frees the eagle's victim at last and breaks the endless chain. We can hold on to that if we want to, the idea that even the longest sentence might one day be lifted by a stranger doing the right thing in passing. Prometheus, of all of them, had earned a rescue. But for a very long time, before any rescue came, there was just the rock and the wind at the edge of the world, and a kind soul paying an unkind price for the gift of warmth. The mother who wept herself to stone. We turn now from the punished to the grieving, and to a queen who made a single very human mistake, the kind almost any proud parent might make, and lost everything for it in an afternoon. Her name was Niobe, and she was the queen of Thebes, and by every worldly measure she had won at life. She was wealthy. She was royal. Her husband was a gifted king. And most of all, she was the mother of 14 children, 7 boys and 7 girls, all healthy, all beautiful, a whole bright crowd of them filling the palace with noise. In a world where so many children didn't survive to grow up, 14 was not just a family. It was a fortune. It was proof, Niobe felt, that she was blessed above other women. And Niobe, being human, could not resist saying so out loud. There was a festival in Thebes honouring the goddess Leto, the mother of the divine twins Apollo and Artemis. The women of the city were gathering to offer their worship, laying wreaths, burning incense, praying to a goddess who had, after all, only 2 children to Niobe's 14. And Niobe watched all this devotion flowing toward Leto and felt a hot flush of resentment. Why, she demanded, should the city worship a goddess with a mere pair of children, when she, Niobe, stood right there among them with 7 times as many? What had Leto done that Niobe hadn't done twice over? She told the women to stop their worship. She suggested in front of everyone that if anyone in Thebes deserved to be honoured as a great mother, it was her. It's such a recognisable feeling. The pride of a parent looking at their children and thinking, surely this counts for something. Surely this makes me special. On any ordinary day it would have been a bit of harmless boasting. But Leto was listening, and Leto was a goddess, and she was not in the habit of being told she was second best by a mortal queen in front of a crowd. Leto went to her twins. And her twins, Apollo and Artemis, both of them expert archers, both fiercely protective of their mother's honour, came down to Thebes to settle the matter. We will move through what happened next softly, because it is genuinely one of the sadder passages in all of these stories, and there's no need to dwell on the specifics. The 2 divine archers went through Niobe's children, one by one. The 7 sons first, struck down as they exercised and rode outside the city walls. Then, despite Niobe's frantic pleading, despite her offering to keep even one, just one, the 7 daughters as well. In the space of a single day, the proudest mother in Thebes went from 14 children to none. Her whole fortune, the entire basis of her boast, gone by evening. And here is where the story turns from horror into something stranger and more tender. Niobe did not rage. She did not plot revenge, which would have been futile against gods anyway. She simply sat down among the loss of everything she had, and she wept, and she could not stop weeping. She wept through the day and into the night and through the next day. Her grief was so total, so bottomless, that it stopped being something she was doing and became something she was. The gods, looking down, seemed to have felt something almost like pity, or perhaps they simply understood that a grief that large could not go on inside a living body without breaking it. So they changed her. Slowly, as she sat there, Niobe began to turn to stone. Her weeping body hardened and greyed and became rock, until she was a stone figure in the shape of a mourning woman. And then the wind carried the stone that had been Niobe away to a mountainside in her original homeland, and set her down on a high peak, and left her there. But the transformation wasn't complete, and this is the detail that makes people go quiet. Even as stone, even as a weathered grey outcrop on a distant mountain, Niobe kept weeping. Water ran down the rock face, trickling from the stone, running down what had been her cheeks. Forever. The Greeks pointed to an actual rock formation on an actual mountain, one that seemed to weep with spring water and morning damp, and they said, "That is Niobe. She is still up there. She is still crying. She will never stop," because a mother's grief that deep doesn't stop just because the body it lived in has turned to stone. They found this comforting, oddly, and I think I understand why. There's something almost gentle in the idea that grief can be permanent without being unbearable, that it can settle into the landscape and simply become part of the world. A quiet weeping rock on a hillside that no longer has to feel the sharp edge of the loss, only the endless soft fact of it. Niobe's punishment was terrible, but her transformation was, in a way, a mercy. The stone doesn't feel the arrows anymore, it only remembers the tears. And the lesson the Greeks took from her was not really about the gods at all. It was about the danger of measuring your happiness by counting what you have and daring the world to take it. Niobe had everything, and she said so, and saying so seemed to summon the very forces that took it away. So they told their children, "Be grateful quietly. Don't count your blessings too loudly where the powerful can hear you." Up on her mountain, the rock is still damp in the mornings. If you didn't know the story, you'd think it was only water. The hunter who saw what he shouldn't have. Stay in the world of the goddess Artemis a moment longer, because she features in another of these stories, and this one turns on a piece of bad luck so unfair it almost feels designed to make you argue with it. You've just woken up as a young nobleman named Actaeon, and you are, by all accounts, having a wonderful morning. You are out hunting in the hills with your companions and your dogs, a great pack of hounds you've raised and named and trained yourself, and the hunting has been good. The sun is high. You've decided to break off from the group, to wander a little on your own through the wooded valley and cool down in the shade. You are doing nothing wrong. Remember that part. Everything that happens to Actaeon happens to a man who did absolutely nothing wrong. The valley he wandered into had a hidden grotto in it, a shaded pool fed by a spring, screened by rocks and trees. And on this particular day, in that particular pool, the goddess Artemis was bathing. Artemis, you have to understand, was the most fiercely private of all the gods. She was the goddess of the hunt and the wilderness and the moon, and she had sworn off romantic entanglement entirely, and she guarded her privacy and her modesty with an intensity that brooked no exceptions. Her attendants bathed with her, hidden away in this secret spot precisely so that no mortal eye would ever fall on her. She had taken every reasonable precaution. She was as far from prying eyes as it was possible to be. And then a young man came stumbling through the trees, looking for a cool place to rest, and walked directly into the one clearing in all of Greece he should never have seen. He didn't mean to. That's the whole tragedy of it. He wasn't spying. He hadn't heard she was there and crept in to sneak a look. He was a tired hunter who took a wrong turn, and he came around the rocks, and suddenly there was the goddess, unclothed and unguarded, staring back at him. Her attendants shrieked and rushed to screen her with their bodies. Artemis herself flushed with fury and shame, and a mortal had seen what no mortal was permitted to see. There was no court to plead his case in. There was no consideration of intent, no weighing of accident against crime. Artemis did not care that it was an accident. She cared only that it had happened, and that it could not be allowed to have happened, and so she reached for the nearest water and flung it into his face, and as the droplets struck him she spoke the words of his transformation. If he wanted to tell the world he had seen the goddess bathing, she said, then let him try. Antlers began to sprout from his forehead. His neck lengthened. His ears grew long and pointed. His arms became slender legs. His hands and feet hardened into hooves, and a dappled hide spread across his skin. In a matter of moments the young hunter Actaeon was gone, and where he had stood there was a stag, wide-eyed and trembling, still with a man's terrified mind trapped inside the animal's body. And then he heard his dogs. You can see where this is going, and it is exactly as awful as you fear, so we will pass over it lightly. The great pack of hounds that Actaeon had raised from puppies, that he had fed and named and loved, caught the scent of a stag nearby, and did what they had been trained all their lives to do. They gave chase, and Actaeon, with the body of a deer and the mind of a man, ran from his own beloved dogs across the hills he had hunted that very morning, unable to call out to them, unable to say his own name, unable to tell them who he was. They did not recognize him. Why would they? And they caught him, as hounds catch a stag, and that was the end of the young man who took a wrong turn on a beautiful morning. His companions, meanwhile, were calling out for him across the valley, wishing he'd hurry up and join them, sad that Actaeon was missing such a fine hunt, not knowing that Actaeon was the hunt, that he was the very quarry they'd have been proud to bring down. Now, what are we supposed to do with a story like that? Because the honest thing to say is that Actaeon did not deserve it. Tantalus earned his pool. Sisyphus earned his stone. Actaeon earned nothing but a moment's bad navigation, and for that he lost his life in the most horrifying way imaginable. The Greeks knew this. They told the story knowing it was unfair, and I don't think the unfairness was an accident. I think it was the point. Because the gods in these stories are not moral in the way we'd like them to be. They are forces. They are like weather, like fire, like the sea, powerful and beautiful, and completely indifferent to whether you meant well. Artemis wasn't punishing wickedness. She was reacting, the way a wild thing reacts when cornered, and a mortal happened to be standing in the path of that reaction. The lesson of Actaeon isn't be good. It's something older and colder than that. It's be careful, because there are powers in the world that will undo you without hatred, without reason, simply because you were in the wrong place, and no amount of innocence will save you. That's a hard thing to fall asleep on, so let me soften it the way the Greeks sometimes did. They believed that telling these stories was itself a kind of protection. To know about Actaeon's grotto was to know that such grottos existed, to move through the world a little more gently, a little more aware that the sacred could be anywhere, hidden behind any screen of rocks. The story was a warning passed down so that maybe you wouldn't take that particular wrong turn yourself. His dogs, the old tellers said, searched for their missing master for a long time afterward, whining and restless, unable to understand where he had gone. Some versions say they were inconsolable. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not the antlers, not the chase. The dogs afterward looking for the man they loved and never finding him, never knowing they already had. The weaver who was too good. There was a girl in a small town in Lydia named Arachne, and she could weave. Not the way other people could weave, competently, usefully, turning wool into cloth for the household. Arachne wove the way the very best musicians play, the way a great cook cooks, with a skill so far beyond ordinary skill, but watching her felt less like watching work, and more like watching a small miracle repeat itself over and over at a loom. She wasn't born to anything special. Her father dyed wool for a living, staining fleece the deep reds and purples that wealthy people paid for. And Arachne had grown up around fibres and colour and the loom, and somewhere along the way her ability had simply outgrown its surroundings. People came from the neighbouring towns just to watch her work. The local nymphs, the minor spirits of the streams and hills, were said to leave their waters and their trees to gather around her and marvel, not just at the finished cloth, but at the way her fingers moved, the way raw wool became art in her hands. And people, being people, said the natural thing. They said, surely a gift like this came from the goddess. Surely Athena herself, the divine patron of weaving and craft, must have taught this girl. Where else could such skill come from? Arachne did not care for that. She wanted the credit. All of it. She had worked for this, practiced for this, ruined her eyes and cramped her hands for years achieving this, and she bristled at the suggestion that her talent was really Athena's talent operating through her. She said so. She said loudly enough that it travelled, that she owed the goddess nothing, that her skill was her own, and that if Athena thought otherwise, the goddess was welcome to come down and compete with her directly and see who was better. That word compete is the one that undoes her, because you can be the best mortal weaver who ever lived, but you cannot challenge a god to a contest and expect the ordinary rules to protect you. Athena heard, of course. She always heard. And she came to Arachne first in disguise, as an old woman leaning on a staff, and she gave the girl a chance to walk it back. Be as skilled as you like among mortals, the old woman advised, but show some humility before the goddess, and ask her pardon for the boast, and she'll forgive you. It was a genuine offer. A door left open. Arachne only had to be a little humble, and she could keep her life and her gift both. Arachne told the old woman to mind her own business. She wasn't afraid. She'd said what she said, and she meant it, and if Athena wanted a contest, let her stop hiding behind wrinkles and show up. So Athena dropped the disguise, stood revealed in her full divine presence, and the contest was on. Here's the thing that makes Arachne's story ache more than most. She wasn't bluffing. When the two of them sat at their looms and began, the girl was not outmatched. She was extraordinary. Athena wove a tapestry showing the gods in all their glory and majesty, powerful and righteous, with little warning scenes in the corners depicting foolish mortals who had dared to challenge the gods and been punished for it. It was a masterpiece, and it was also a threat, woven politely into the border. And Arachne wove back. She wove a tapestry showing the gods at their worst. All the times they had deceived and abandoned and mistreated mortals, all their pettiness and their cruelty and their disguises, laid out in thread with devastating skill and not a shred of flattery. It was, by every account including Athena's own furious inward admission, flawless, technically perfect. You could not find a loose thread or a false line in it anywhere. The mortal girl had matched the goddess of craft, and worse, she had told the truth about the gods while doing it. Athena could not bear it. Not the loss, exactly, because it wasn't clear she had lost. It was the perfection of the insult, the truth of it, the sheer talent deployed to humiliate the divine. In her rage she struck the girl and tore the tapestry, and Arachne, proud Arachne, understood at last what she had done, and what it was going to cost her, and could not face it. She tried to end her own life, rather than live with the goddess's wrath. And Athena, at that final moment, felt the anger drain into something more complicated, something that was almost mercy, but shaped like a curse. She would not let the girl slip away. Instead, she sprinkled her with a bitter potion, and as it touched her, Arachne began to change. Her hair fell away, her nose and ears vanished, her body shrank and darkened and drew inward. Her clever fingers multiplied and became thin, delicate legs, and from her belly she began to spin a thread, fine and strong and endless. Athena had turned her into a spider. Live then, the goddess told her. Live and keep weaving, you and all your descendants, forever. And so Arachne wove on, and her children wove on, and their children after them, hanging their silk in the corners of the world, spinning perfect geometric webs out of nothing every single night, a whole eternal lineage of the finest weavers there ever were. Reduced to small dark things we brush from our door frames without a second. Thought. It's why spiders are called arachnids. All of them, everywhere, named for a proud girl from Lydia who was simply too good and said so too loudly. And every web you have ever ducked through in a doorway, every silver thread strung between two branches in the morning dew, is the work of Arachne's family, still weaving, still perfect, still unable to stop. The next time one drops down in front of you on its invisible line, you might look a little closer at the pattern it's making. There's a very old grievance in it. And there's genius too, the kind that once matched a god thread for thread and was punished not for failing, but for being right. The musician who almost made it out. Now we come to the most famous sad story of them all. The one that people who know nothing else about Greek myth still somehow know, and we come to it gently. Because it is about the two things everyone in the dark is thinking about anyway. Love and loss. And how thin the line is between having someone and having them gone. His name was Orpheus, and he was the greatest musician who ever lived. Not a good musician, not a famous one, the greatest full stop, in a world where music was understood to be a kind of magic. When Orpheus played his lyre and sang, wild animals lay down peacefully to listen. Trees uprooted themselves and shuffled closer. Rivers slowed in their beds. Stones, it was said, were moved, both the literal ones and the ones inside people. His mother was one of the muses, the divine sources of art and inspiration, so the gift was in his blood. But even among the gifted, he was something the world had never seen. And Orpheus fell in love, completely, with a young woman named Eurydice. She loved him back. They married, and for a little while, in the way of these stories that always begin with a fragment of real happiness before the world remembers itself, they were simply happy, a musician and his bride at the start of a whole life together. It didn't last past the wedding day. Eurydice was walking through the grass, some say fleeing a man who was pursuing her, when she stepped on a serpent hidden in the meadow. It struck her ankle, and the poison did its quiet work, and before the marriage had properly begun, Eurydice's life ended, and she passed down into the underworld, into the realm of the dead, leaving Orpheus standing alone in the sunlight of what should have been the happiest week of his life. Most people, faced with this, grieve, they break, and they rage, and eventually, slowly, they learn to live alongside the loss, because there is nothing else to be done. The dead do not come back. That is the one rule underneath all the other rules. The door only opens one way. Orpheus did not accept this. He decided he would go and get her. Physically, he would walk down into the land of the dead, alive with his lyre on his back, and he would ask for her back. And if asking didn't work, he would do the only thing he knew how to do. He would play. So he found one of the entrances to the underworld, and he descended, down through the dark passages that no living person was meant to walk, past all the guardians and the barriers designed to keep the living out and the dead in. And at each one, instead of fighting or bribing or fleeing, he played. He played for the ferryman who carried souls across the Black River, and the ferryman, who had never once made an exception, took the living man aboard. He played for the monstrous three-headed hound that guarded the gates, and the great beast that let no one pass grew calm and let him by. He played his way down through every defence the kingdom of the dead had, not by force, but by being so unbearably, beautifully sad that nothing in the underworld could bring itself to stop him. And finally he came before the king and queen of that dark realm themselves, the rulers of all the departed, and he played for them. He sang about Eurydice. He sang about their love and about her death, and about the emptiness he had been walking around in ever since. And he sang about how everyone ends up in this kingdom eventually. So what was the harm in letting one soul go a little early, to be repaid in full when her natural time came? He sang the grief of every person who has ever lost someone too soon, and he sang it with the greatest voice that ever existed. The old stories say something remarkable happened. The bloodless shades of the dead wept to hear it. The endless punishments paused. Even the queen of the underworld, who had heard every plea and denied them all, felt her cold heart move. And the king of the dead, moved past his own iron rule, agreed. Orpheus could take Eurydice back up to the land of the living. She could have her life again. There was one condition. As they climbed the long dark path back toward the sunlight, Orpheus leading and Eurydice following behind, he was not to look back at her. Not once. Not until they had both fully emerged into the light of the upper world. He had to trust that she was there behind him, following in the darkness, and simply keep walking, and not turn around no matter what, until they were both out. You already know. You've known since I started. But let's walk the last few steps with him anyway. He climbed. Up through the dark, up the long steep path, his lyre silent now, listening for her footsteps behind him and hearing nothing. Because the dead make no sound. That was the torment of it, worse than any eagle or boulder. He couldn't hear her, he couldn't feel her. He had only the king's promise that she was there, somewhere in the black behind him. And the further he climbed, the more the doubt gnawed at him. What if the god had tricked him? What if she wasn't there at all, and he was climbing alone, about to walk out into the daylight by himself and lose her a second time? What if she had fallen behind, or couldn't keep up, or the whole thing had been a cruel joke on the greatest fool who ever loved someone? He was almost out. Some say he had already stepped into the light himself, and only she remained in the last stretch of shadow. And there, one step from safety, after everything, after charming the ferryman and the hound and the very rulers of the dead, after the greatest performance in the history of the world, Orpheus could not bear the not knowing for one more second, and he turned around to look. She was there. She had been there the whole time, following faithfully in the dark. He saw her face for one instant, saw her looking back at him with love, and with a dawning, terrible understanding. And then, because he had broken the one condition, she began to slip backward, drawn down again into the dark, reaching out for him as she went, calling his name, or perhaps not even able to call it, just reaching. And he reached back and caught nothing but air. She was gone. Back down into the kingdom of the dead, this time for good. One step. He was one step away. He had done the impossible, walked into death and out again, and undone it all at the very last moment, because he loved her too much to trust that she was following. He tried to go back down. Of course he did. But the door does not open twice. The ferryman would not take him again. He sat at the edge of the underworld for days, playing, begging, and this time the music was not enough, because nothing is enough twice. Eventually he climbed back up into a world that no longer had her in it, and he wandered it alone, playing songs so sorrowful that the very rocks and rivers grieved along with him until his own end came, which is a whole other sad story we may or may not have the heart for tonight. Here is what I think that story is really about, and why it has outlived nearly all the others. It's not about the gods being cruel, because they weren't, this time. They gave him a genuine chance. It's about the fact that grief makes us look back. That when we have lost someone and are somehow impossibly given the sense that we might get them back, we cannot help but turn around to check, to make sure, to confirm that the good thing is really there, and in the turning we sometimes lose it again. Orpheus is every person who couldn't quite trust their good fortune, who reached back to touch what they'd been given and found it dissolving in their hands. She was there the whole time. That's the part that stays with you as you drift off. She was right behind him, following in faith, one step from the sun. And all he had to do was not look. And he looked. The boy who fell in love with himself. After all that, let's move to something a little lighter in its cruelty. A story about vanity rather than grief. Though it ends in a quiet fading too, because most of these do. There was once a young man named Narcissus who was so beautiful that everyone who saw him fell instantly and hopelessly in love. Men, women, nymphs of the woods and waters, it didn't matter. One look at Narcissus and a person was lost, following him around, aching for him, offering him their whole heart. And Narcissus, who had been beautiful his entire life, and had never once had to work for affection, treated every single one of them with cold indifference. He didn't want them. He didn't want anyone. He wandered through the world collecting broken hearts the way a walk through burrs collects burrs, without noticing, without caring, leaving a trail of the lovesick behind him wherever he went. Among the ones who fell for him was a mountain nymph named Echo, and Echo's own story is a small tragedy tucked inside the larger one. She had, some time before, gotten on the wrong side of the goddess Hera. Echo used to talk too much, chattering on cleverly to distract Hera, while other nymphs slipped away from the goddess's notice, and when Hera realized she'd been played, she cursed Echo in a way perfectly fitted to the crime. Echo, who loved to talk, would never again be able to say anything of her own. She could only repeat the last words that were spoken to her. That was all that was left to her voice. The final few words of whatever she heard bounced helplessly back. So when Echo saw Narcissus in the forest and fell in love like everyone did, she had no way to tell him. She could only follow, hidden among the trees, waiting for him to speak so she could echo something back and be near him. Once, separated from his companions, Narcissus called out into the woods, "Is anyone here?" And Echo, joyfully, called back the only thing she could, "Here. Here." He looked around, confused, and said, "Come to me," and she cried, "Come to me," and rushed out from the trees with her arms open, ready at last to be with him. And Narcissus recoiled. He wanted nothing to do with her. He said he would rather his life end than let her have him, and Echo, humiliated, heartbroken, could only whisper back the ruins of his rejection, have me, to no one. As he walked away, she crept off into the lonely caves and mountain places, and there she wasted away with her unspoken love, growing thinner and quieter, until in the end nothing was left of her at all but her voice. That's what an echo is, the old story says. It's her, still out there in the empty places, still repeating the last thing you say, still unable to speak first. But Narcissus's own reckoning was coming, because one of the many hearts he had carelessly broken had prayed for justice, prayed that Narcissus might one day love someone the way all his victims had loved him, and feel what it was to want someone he could never have. And a goddess of retribution heard the prayer and agreed that it was fair. So one day Narcissus, tired from hunting, knelt at the edge of a still, clear pool to drink, and he saw, looking up at him from the water, the most beautiful face he had ever beheld. He didn't understand at first that he was looking at himself. He thought it was some lovely water spirit living in the pool, gazing up at him with an expression of longing that perfectly matched his own. He fell in love on the spot, harder than anyone had ever fallen for him. He reached down to touch the beautiful face, and it shattered into ripples and vanished. He waited for the water to still, and there it was again, gazing up, yearning. He leaned down to kiss it, and his lips met only cold water, and the image broke apart once more. And there Narcissus stayed, at the edge of the pool, in love with a reflection that fled every time he reached for it, that leaned in when he leaned in and drew back when he drew back, that wanted him exactly as much and exactly as uselessly as he wanted it. He could not leave. He could not eat or rest. He had finally found the one love he could not have, and it was his own face. And he stared at it until he understood, in a slow and dawning horror, that the beautiful stranger was him, that there was no one there to love him back, that he was going to fade away at the edge of a pool longing for a person who did not exist. He wasted away just as Echo had, Poor Echo, who was still nearby, still repeating his final murmurs back to him. The two of them fading together, one from unrequited love of another, and one from unrequited love of himself. And when Narcissus was gone, and they came to gather his remains, there was nothing there. Only a small nodding flower at the water's edge, white petals around a golden centre, bending its head over its own reflection in the pool. They named it after him. It's still called that. You've seen a whole spring hillside full of them, bowing their heads toward the ground, and now you know they're all just Narcissus, still looking for himself in the water. The Greeks had a sharp point buried in the prettiness of that one. Narcissus's punishment wasn't imposed by the gods out of nowhere. It was exactly, precisely what he had done to others, handed back to him. He had made dozens of people love what they could never have, so he was made to love what he could never have. It's the same symmetry we keep meeting tonight. The crime returned, the reacher made to reach. An echo, meanwhile, is still out there. Say something into an empty valley, or a stairwell, or a long-tiled hall, and listen to the last words come back to you a little softer than you sent them. That's her, keeping the only promise her curse allowed. She loved a boy who couldn't love her, and now she just answers, faithfully, forever, always getting the last word and never getting to choose it. The boy who flew too high. You've just woken up on a small rocky island, and you're a boy named Icarus, and your father is the cleverest man in the ancient world. That combination, a brilliant father and a young son, is about to produce one of the oldest cautionary tales there is, and like most of them it's sadder up close than it is from a distance. Your father is Daedalus, and Daedalus is an inventor and craftsman of almost supernatural skill, the sort of man who can build anything, solve anything, make wood and metal and stone do things no one thought possible. And that brilliance is exactly why the two of you are trapped. Daedalus had been employed by a powerful king on the island of Crete, and he had built things for that king, including, famously, an enormous maze so complex that no one who entered it could ever find their way out. But Daedalus knew too much, and had helped the wrong people, and the king had turned on him, and now the master builder and his young son were imprisoned on the very island whose wonders Daedalus had created. They couldn't leave by sea. The king controlled every ship, watched every harbour. They couldn't leave by land. And so Daedalus, being Daedalus, looked up. The king controlled the sea and the land, he reasoned, but he did not control the sky. So the inventor began, in secret, to build. He gathered feathers, large ones and small ones, and laid them out in careful rows from shortest to longest, the way a bird's wing tapers. He bound them together with thread, and sealed them with wax, curving the whole arrangement into the shape of a real wing. Working with the patience of a man whose life and his child's life depended on getting every feather right. He made 2 great wings for himself, and 2 smaller ones for Icarus. And when they were finished, he fitted them to their arms and shoulders, and taught the boy how to use them, how to move, how to catch the air. And he gave his son one instruction, one rule, repeated until he was sure the boy had it. Fly the middle path. Don't fly too low, he warned, because the damp and the spray from the sea would soak the feathers and weigh the wings down. But above all, don't fly too high, because the heat of the sun would soften the wax that held the feathers in place, and the wings would come apart. Stay in the middle, not too low, not too high. Follow me, and keep to the middle of the sky, and we'll both make it. Icarus promised. Of course he promised. He was a boy who had never flown, being told the rules of flying, and he agreed to all of them the way you agree to anything you don't yet fully understand. And they launched themselves off the cliffs, and it worked. It actually worked. The two of them rose into the open air on their handmade wings, and the impossible became real, and they flew out over the wine-dark sea, leaving the prison island behind them. Fishermen looked up from their boats, and shepherds looked up from their hills, and saw two figures passing overhead through the empty sky, and took them for gods, because what else could a flying man be? For a while Icarus flew the middle path, just as his father had told him. He stayed in the safe band of air, following the older man's lead, doing everything right. But he was a boy. And he was flying. Try to imagine it, really, the first human child ever to feel the air hold him up, to look down and see the sea far below and the whole world spread out, and the wind rushing past. Try to imagine being young and free for the first time in your life, out of the prison, out over the open water, with wings on your back and the entire sky to yourself. Of course the middle path started to feel too cautious. Of course the boy began to climb. He forgot his father's warning, or he remembered it and didn't believe it, or he simply couldn't help himself, drunk on the sheer joy of it, wanting to go higher, to fly up toward the sun itself, to see how far this miracle would take him. And the higher he climbed, the warmer it grew, and the wax, exactly as his father had said, began to soften. The feathers started to loosen. One, then another, slipping free of the melting wax and drifting away on the wind behind him. And Icarus, laughing up there in the heights, didn't notice at first, didn't feel the wings beginning to fail, until suddenly they weren't holding the air anymore, until he flapped his arms and found there were fewer and fewer feathers to catch on, until the wings that had carried him aloft came apart in the warm high air, and there was nothing beneath him at all. He fell. Down out of the bright heights, past the middle path he should have kept to, down toward the sea, calling out for his father the whole long way down, and he was gone into the water before Daedalus, flying ahead, even understood what had happened. The father turned and saw feathers on the waves, just feathers, scattered across the surface where his son had been. He circled and called the boy's name and understood, and there was nothing his brilliance could do about any of it, because being the cleverest man in the world does not let you catch a falling child. He gathered what he could. He named the sea and the nearby island after his boy, so that the place would carry the name forever, and he flew on alone to safety, which must have been the emptiest arrival to safety anyone ever made. We reach for this story so often that we've almost worn the sadness off it. Don't fly too close to the sun has become a tidy little proverb about ambition, about pride, about knowing your limits, and it is that. But underneath the proverb is just a father and a son and a warning that wasn't heeded, and the particular grief of a parent who did everything right, who built the wings and taught the lesson and led the way, and still could not save the child from the child's own bright, reckless joy. There's a detail I find almost unbearably tender. In some tellings, as they made the wings together, young Icarus played in the workshop, chasing the feathers as they drifted, pressing his thumbs into the soft wax, getting in the way, delighted, having no idea that his father was building the thing that would carry him up and let him fall. He thought it was wonderful. He was helping. And it was wonderful, right up until it wasn't. The feathers are still on the water. In the story, the father is still flying on alone. and the sea down there still carries the boy's name. The boy who borrowed the sun's chariot if Icarus reached too high on borrowed wings. There was another young man who reached even higher, on something far more dangerous than wings, and burned a good deal more than himself on the way down. His name was Phaethon, and he had a problem that a lot of young people have, though few have had it on this cosmic a scale. He didn't know who his father was, or rather he'd been told, but he wasn't sure he believed it, and the not being sure was eating him alive. His mother had told him that his father was Helios, the sun god himself, the blazing being who drove the chariot of the sun across the sky every single day, from the eastern edge of the world to the western one, bringing daylight to the whole earth. That's quite a thing to be told about your absent father. And Phaethon desperately wanted it to be true. A friend of his had scoffed at the claim, mocked him for it, said he was making it up, that no boy from an ordinary household had the sun for a father, and the mockery lodged in Phaethon and festered, until he could not stand it any more, and he went to his mother and demanded some proof, some sign, anything to settle it. And his mother, stung on his behalf, told him to go and ask the sun god directly. Travel east, she said, to the palace where the sun begins its journey, and ask Helios himself. He won't deny you. So Phaethon made the long journey to the east, to the shining palace at the edge of the world, and walked in and found the great god Helios seated on his throne, radiant, surrounded by the hours and the days and the seasons. And the boy, shading his eyes against the glare, asked the question he had crossed the world to ask. Are you really my father? And Helios, moved by the sight of his son, set aside his blinding brightness so the boy could look at him, and said yes. Yes, you are my child, and to prove it, to make up for all the years of absence and doubt, he made a promise that gods should know better than to make. He swore a great binding oath, the kind even a god cannot break, that he would give Phaethon anything he asked for. Anything at all. Name it, and it's yours. As proof that I am your father, and I love you. You can feel the trap closing, can't you? Because there was only one thing a boy in Phaethon's position, a boy who had been mocked and doubted, and who wanted so badly to prove he was special, was ever going to ask for. He asked to drive the chariot of the sun, for one day. He wanted to take the reins of the blazing chariot and drive the sun across the sky himself, so that the whole world would look up and see him doing it. And no one could ever again say he wasn't the son of the sun. And Helios was horrified. He begged the boy to choose anything else. This one thing, he pleaded, is the one thing you must not ask, because it's the one thing that will destroy you. The horses that pull the sun are wild and immensely powerful. The path across the sky is steep and terrifying and narrow. Even I, he said, a god, can barely control them. No mortal hand can hold those reins. You will not survive it. Ask for something else, anything else, and it's yours. But Phaethon had asked, and Helios had sworn the unbreakable oath, and a boy who has finally been told he is special is not going to give up the one chance to prove it to the entire world. He insisted, and the god, bound by his own foolish promise, weeping, had to let him. So they harnessed the 4 wild horses to the golden chariot, and as dawn broke, Phaethon climbed aboard and took the reins, and the gates of the east were flung open, and the horses leapt forward into the sky. And immediately everything went wrong. The horses felt at once that the chariot was lighter than usual, that the hand on the reins was weak and unsure, that whoever was driving them today was not their master. And they bolted. They tore off the familiar path, plunging and rearing, dragging the sun and the terrified boy careening across the heavens with no control at all. Phaethon hauled on the reins, and the horses ignored him. He didn't even know the way, didn't know the names of the stars or the proper road, and the chariot swung wildly up and down through the sky. When it flew too high, the earth below grew cold, and the heavens themselves were scorched. And when the panicking boy let it plunge too low, the sun came down close to the earth, and that was the true catastrophe. Mountain tops caught fire, rivers steamed and shrank. Whole regions of the world were scorched and blasted by the sun passing too near. The old stories said this was how great deserts were made, and how certain peoples came to have darker skin, burned by the day the sun ran wild. The whole world was beginning to burn, because a boy who wanted to prove he was special had gotten hold of something no one his age should ever touch. And up above, Phaethon was no longer trying to prove anything. He was just a terrified child clinging to a runaway chariot, high above a burning world, understanding far too late exactly what his father had tried to tell him. The earth itself cried out for help, and the plea reached the king of the gods, who saw that the whole world was about to be lost if the wild ride continued. And so Zeus did the only thing that could stop it. With great reluctance to save the earth entire, he struck the chariot with a thunderbolt, and Phaethon was flung from it, falling in a long arc of light through the sky like a shooting star, all the way down into a great river far below, where his ride and his life both came to an end. His sisters came and mourned him at the river bank, and wept so long and so inconsolably that they were transformed into poplar trees, rooted along the water forever, and their falling tears hardened into amber, the golden resin that still bleeds from certain trees to this day. So the story says that amber is the mourning of Phaethon's sisters, weeping for the brother who wanted so badly to be special that he took the sun for a joyride and lost everything, and nearly took the world with him. It's the same shape as Icarus, isn't it? A young person, a warning, the warning ignored, the fall. But there's an extra ache in Phaethon's version, because his whole disaster grew out of something so understandable. He just wanted to know his father was really his father. He just wanted to not be laughed at. And a god who loved him made a promise he couldn't take back. And love and pride and a boy's need to prove himself combined into the one request that could undo them all. The amber's still out there. People wear it, polish it, set it in rings, most of them never knowing they're wearing the hardened tears of grieving sisters for a boy who flew the sun and fell. The woman who told the truth and was never believed there was a princess of Troy named Cassandra, and her story contains what might be the single most exquisitely designed torment in all of these tales, worse in its way than any rolling stone or hungry eagle, because it happened entirely inside a person's mind and in full view of everyone she loved. Cassandra was a daughter of the royal house of Troy, beautiful and clever, in the years before the great war that would bring her city down. And she caught the eye of a god. Apollo, the god of prophecy among his many domains, wanted her and set about winning her the way gods do, with an extravagant gift. He offered to give her the power of prophecy, the ability to see the future clearly and truly, if she would be his. And Cassandra, dazzled by the offer, accepted the gift. She let him grant her the sight, and then, once she had the power, she changed her mind about the rest of the bargain. she refused him. Now, a mortal cannot simply take back a divine gift once it's given. That's not how it works. Apollo could not ungrant the prophecy. What he could do, and did, wounded and furious at being refused after he'd already paid, was add a second enchantment on top of the first, one that poisoned the gift from the inside. He bent close, as if to seal the original blessing, and instead he laid a curse over it. She would keep the power to see the future, exactly as promised. She would always be right, but no one would ever believe her, not once, not ever. Her every true prophecy would be dismissed as raving, as madness, as the nonsense of a disturbed young woman, no matter how clearly and accurately she spoke. Sit with the horror of that, because it's a specific and modern kind of horror. Cassandra could see what was coming. All of it. And she was condemned to watch it come, powerless to stop any of it, while everyone around her treated her warnings as the babbling of a lunatic. She had perfect knowledge and zero credibility. She was, permanently, the person in the room who is right, and whom no one will listen to. She saw the war coming to Troy before it came. She warned them, and they ignored her. She saw disaster in the great wooden horse the Greeks left outside the city gates, the famous gift that the Trojans wheeled inside their own walls in celebration. Cassandra stood there and told them plainly that the horse would be the end of the city, that there were enemies hidden inside it. That bringing it in meant the fall of Troy. And her own people, her own family, looked at the frantic princess screaming about the horse, and shook their heads sadly, and wheeled it in anyway. Because everyone knew poor Cassandra had gone mad. Everyone knew you couldn't take her raving seriously. Everyone had learnt long ago to just let her rave and get on with the celebration. And that night, as she had foreseen in perfect detail, the enemies came out of the horse, and the city was lost. Even her own end she saw coming, and even that no one would hear. After Troy fell, she was carried off far across the sea to the household of a Greek king, and she knew, because she always knew, exactly what waited for her there. She saw her own life ending in that foreign palace before she ever arrived. She spoke of it. And of course, no one believed her about that either, right up until the moment it happened just as she'd said. That's the shape of Cassandra's whole existence. Perfect sight, total isolation. Every prophecy a fresh proof that she was right, and a fresh reminder that being right saved no one, least of all her. She spent her life as the loneliest kind of person there is, the one who can see the cliff coming and cannot make anyone slow down, who has to stand and watch the crash arrive on schedule, exactly as foretold, exactly as ignored. We've all had a smaller taste of it. The warning no one heeds. The bad idea you can see going wrong and cannot talk anyone out of. The knowledge that you'll be proven right eventually, and that being proven right will feel like nothing at all, because by then the damage will already be done. Cassandra is the goddess or the ghost of that particular helplessness. She's the reason her name became a word we still use for the person who foresees disaster and is dismissed. A Cassandra. Right, unheard, and alone with it. There's no rescue in her story. No hero passes by to break her chains, because her chains were invisible and lived behind her eyes. She simply saw everything and told everyone, and was believed by no one, from the day she refused a god to the day her own foreseen end arrived on time. the truest voice in Troy, treated as the maddest, for the crime of changing her mind about a bargain. And the terrible small mercy at the centre of it is that she never once got to enjoy being right. Every time the future arrived exactly as she'd described it, there was no vindication in it. Only the fresh grief of having watched it come and been unable to stop it. Imagine knowing you're right your whole life and never, not once, getting to say I told you so to anyone who'd take it in. That was Cassandra. She told them. They didn't listen. The horse rolled in. The girl traded for a win. Now we come to one of the quieter tragedies of that same war. One that happened before the fighting even began. And it turns on a father who had to make a choice that no one should ever have to make, and made it, and had to live inside the making of it forever after. The great fleet of Greek ships had gathered to sail for Troy, 1,000 of them, an enormous army assembled from every corner of Greece, kings and their men all crowded into the harbour, waiting to launch the greatest military expedition the world had seen. And they could not leave. The winds would not come. Day after day the sails hung slack, the sea lay flat, and the whole vast army sat stranded on the shore, unable to sail, tempers fraying, supplies dwindling, the great war delayed before it could even start. The commander of this enormous force was a king named Agamemnon, and he was told by those who read such things why the winds had failed. A goddess had been offended, and she was holding the winds hostage, and there was only one thing that would appease her and free the fleet to sail. The price she was asking was Agamemnon's own daughter, a young woman named Iphigenia. To get his wind, the commander would have to give up his child. We're going to move through this very gently, because it's genuinely one of the most painful choices in all of these stories, and the pain of it is the whole point. Agamemnon was first a father. He loved his daughter, and every instinct a parent has recoiled from what he was being asked to do. But he was also the commander of 1,000 ships, and the leader of an alliance of proud, impatient kings, all of them waiting, all of them watching to see whether he had the resolve to lead them. If he refused, the expedition would collapse. His authority would collapse. And so he was caught between his love for his child and the crushing weight of what everyone expected of him. The war, the alliance, his own honour and position, all of it pressing down on one small girl. He chose the war. But he couldn't do it openly, couldn't bear to, so he did it by deception, which somehow makes it sadder. He sent word home for Iphigenia to be brought to the army's camp, and the reason he gave was a happy one. He told her mother that the girl was to be married, wed to one of the greatest heroes of the Greek army, a magnificent match, a cause for celebration. So Iphigenia came to the camp joyfully, dressed as a bride, expecting a wedding, expecting the beginning of her adult life and her own happiness. She arrived thinking she was the luckiest girl in Greece. And she was not there for a wedding. Different tellers handled the ending differently, because even the ancient Greeks seem to have flinched from it. In the oldest and starkest version, the girl's life was given up to appease the goddess, and the winds came and the fleet sailed for Troy, and a father sailed off to a 10-year war, having traded his own daughter for a favourable breeze. In a gentler version, one that later tellers reached for the way we reach for comfort now, the goddess herself intervened at the last moment, unwilling to accept the girl after all, and spirited Iphigenia away in a cloud, substituting a deer in her place, and carried the girl off to be a priestess in a distant land, alive but lost to her family forever, mourned as gone by everyone who loved her. Either way, the effect on the family was the same. A daughter gone, a wedding dress that was never a wedding dress, and a mother back home, Iphigenia's mother, who learned what her husband had done to their child, and who never ever forgave him. She waited the entire length of the war, 10 long years, nursing that grievance into something cold and absolute, and when Agamemnon finally sailed home victorious from Troy, proud and triumphant, she was waiting for him too, and she made him pay for what he'd done to their daughter. But that's the next thread, and we'll come to it, because in these families the reckonings run in chains, each one setting up the next. What stays with me about Iphigenia is the wedding dress, the joy she arrived with, the complete and total innocence of a girl who thought she was coming to the best day of her life, and walked instead into her father's terrible choice, having no idea, right up until the end, that anything was wrong. She trusted them. She trusted her father. She came when he called, dressed for happiness, and the trust is the part that breaks you. And the wind, when it finally came, was just wind. That's the thing. It filled the sails and the ships pulled away from the shore, and the great war got under way, and the wind itself neither knew nor cared what it had cost. Somewhere a father stood on the deck of his flagship, feeling the breeze he had paid for on his face, sailing toward 10 years of war, and, at the end of it, toward a wife who would be waiting with a very long memory. The winds came, the price was paid, the fleet sailed, and nothing about the breeze felt like enough to have been worth it, because nothing ever could have. The house that ate itself we keep brushing up against this family. So let's finally sit down inside it, because the house of Atreus is the most spectacularly cursed household in all of mythology, a family so comprehensively doomed that its miseries run for generations like a debt that keeps compounding, and it all traces back to that patched-up shoulder we met at the very beginning of the night. Remember Tantalus, the man who served his own son to the gods to test them, and got the eternal pool and fruit for his trouble? His son was Pelops, the boy the gods restored to life with the ivory shoulder. And Pelops grew up and had his own life, and won his own bride through a chariot race that involved a betrayal and a broken promise. And out of that dishonest victory came a curse laid on his whole line. And Pelops had sons, and those sons were named Atreus and Thyestes. And the two brothers hated each other with a completeness that would define the family for generations. The details of what these two brothers did to each other are dark enough that we'll keep the specifics soft, but the shape of it matters. There was a golden ram, a symbol of the right to rule, and each brother schemed to possess it and claim the throne. There was betrayal between them, and adultery and exile, and false reconciliation, back and forth, each brother outdoing the last atrocity with a worse one. And it built to a horrible dinner, an echo of their grandfather's crime coming back around, in which one brother, pretending to make peace, served the other brother a feast made from that brother's own children, without telling him, and let him eat before revealing what he had done. The same crime as Tantalus, the same monstrous meal, resurfacing 2 generations later in the same bloodline, as if the family could not stop reenacting its founding sin. And the surviving child of that horror, one boy who had been spared, grew up with only one purpose, which was to avenge what had been done to his brothers. And he did, adding another layer of retribution to the pile. And so it went, down and down through the generations, each act of vengeance justified by the one before it, and demanding the one after it, a family trapped in a machine of payback that no one could switch off. This brings us back to Agamemnon, who was a grandson of this cursed line, and who we just watched trade his daughter for a favourable wind. When he came home from 10 years at Troy, his wife was waiting, and she had spent that entire decade turning her grief for their daughter into resolve. And she ended his life in revenge for the child he had given up. And then their son, Iphigenia's brother, a young man named Orestes, was caught in the oldest and cruelest trap the family's curse had ever set. Because now the law of vengeance that ran in his blood demanded that he avenge his father. But the person who had ended his father's life was his own mother. The curse was asking him to raise his hand against his own mother to avenge a father who had given up his sister. There was no clean choice anywhere in it. Every path led through something unforgivable. He did it. Driven by the demand for vengeance and by the god Apollo's own command, Orestes avenged his father upon his mother, and in doing so committed a crime so against nature that he was immediately set upon by the Furies, the ancient spirits who pursued those who wronged their own kin. These were dreadful beings, older than the Olympian gods, whose entire purpose was to hound such offenders relentlessly, driving them across the world in torment, never resting, never relenting. And they came for Orestes, and they drove him half out of his mind, chasing him from land to land, a young man who had done a terrible thing, because a terrible thing had been done to his father, because a terrible thing had been done to his sister, because his family had been cursed for generations back to a shoulder made of ivory. Here, at last, is where the story does something the other stories mostly don't. Here the endless machine of vengeance finally gets switched off. Orestes, hounded to the edge of madness, fled to the city of Athens and threw himself on the mercy of the goddess Athena. And Athena did something new. Instead of simply passing judgment herself, or letting the Furies have him, or letting the cycle grind on for another generation, she convened a court. An actual court, with human jurors to weigh the case, to hear both sides, to decide guilt not by the raw law of blood for blood, but by judgment and reason and deliberation. The Furies argued their ancient case, Orestes and Apollo argued his, and the jury voted, and the votes were evenly split, and Athena cast the deciding vote in favour of mercy, and Orestes was released from the curse at last. The Furies were furious, at first robbed of their prey, but Athena persuaded them, honoured them, gave them a new and respected place in the city, transformed them from spirits of blind vengeance into guardians of justice. And with that, the machine that had been running since Tantalus finally stopped. The house of Atreus, after generations of feeding on itself, was released. The curse ended not with one more act of vengeance, but with the invention of something to replace vengeance, which was law. The Greeks were telling themselves something important with that ending, something almost hopeful buried at the bottom of all that horror. They were saying that there is a way out of the endless cycle of harm answering harm, but it isn't more harm, it's the decision to stop, to hand the judgment to something larger than any grieving individual, to let reason and deliberation break the chain that vengeance never can. A whole civilization's worth of pain, running for generations, and the way out turned out to be a courtroom. But it took generations to get there, generations of children paying for the appetites of their grandparents, of people trapped in roles they never chose, ending each other over grievances that started before any of them were born. The house of Atreus is the Greeks looking clearly at how harm passes down through a family, how the wounded become the wounders, how a single act of cruelty at the top of a bloodline can echo down through everyone who comes after. And at the very bottom of it, exhausted, half-mad, hunted by ancient spirits, one young man finally stood in a courtroom, and the world decided, for once, not to demand one more life. It was too late for almost everyone. But it wasn't nothing. It was a door, finally, out of a house that had been eating itself for 100 years. The cleverest woman in the storylets follow a different kind of doom now, one that belongs to a woman who was nobody's helpless victim, who was in fact the most capable person in every room she ever stood in, and whose story the Greeks could never quite decide how to feel about, which is exactly what makes her unforgettable. Her name was Medea, and she was a princess of a distant eastern kingdom, and she was a sorceress of formidable power, granddaughter of the sun god himself, skilled in potions and enchantments and every hidden art. Into her father's kingdom one day came a Greek hero named Jason, on the most famous quest of his generation. He had come to win a fabulous golden fleece that her father guarded, a nearly impossible task guarded by nearly impossible obstacles, and he had no real hope of succeeding on his own. And then Medea saw him, and fell in love, and everything changed, because Medea in love was a force that could reshape the world. She had the power to give Jason everything he needed to succeed, and she used all of it on his behalf. She gave him potions to protect him from fire and harm. She told him how to overcome each deadly obstacle guarding the fleece. She used her magic to subdue the sleepless serpent that coiled around the prize. Without her, Jason would have failed and been lost within a day of arriving. With her, he triumphed and won the fleece, and became a legend. Every bit of his famous success was really her success, her knowledge, her power, deployed for love of him. And she gave up everything for him. She betrayed her own father to help Jason escape. She left her homeland forever, cut herself off from her family and her people, and to buy their escape as they fled, she committed a terrible act against her own brother. A thing so dark it could never be undone, all to secure a future with the man she loved. She burned every bridge behind her. There was no going home for Medea, not ever. She had made herself an exile and worse for Jason's sake, and she had done it willingly, because she believed they would build a life together, and she had made that belief the foundation of her entire existence. They did build a life, for a while. They settled, they had children, and Medea, who had given up her homeland and her family and her innocence for this man, must have thought the price, however terrible, had bought her something real. And then Jason left her for someone else. He arranged to marry a princess, the daughter of a local king, a match that would give him status and security and a proper royal position. He set Medea aside, the woman who had made his entire legend possible, who had abandoned everything she had for him, and he did it with the smooth reasoning of a man who genuinely believed he was being sensible. It was a good match. It would benefit their children too, he argued. She should be grateful, really, and reasonable about it. He seems to have expected her to simply accept it, to step quietly aside, a foreign woman with no family and nowhere to go, discarded for a better offer. He had catastrophically misjudged the person he was discarding. Because Medea was not a woman who could be set aside. She was the most powerful and most dangerous person either of them knew, and she had given up literally everything for him, and now she had nothing left. No homeland, no family, no innocence, and now not even the love she'd traded them all for. And out of that total devastation, that complete betrayal of everything she had sacrificed, came a revenge so terrible that it has disturbed audiences for thousands of years. We will not detail what Medea did, because it is genuinely among the darkest acts in all of these stories, and the horror of it doesn't need illustrating. It is enough to say that she struck at Jason in the way that would leave him most utterly destroyed, that she made certain he would lose everything the way she had lost everything, and that she chose to wound herself grievously in the process, because the wound to him was worth it to her. She took from him his future, his new marriage, and finally the children they shared, in an act of vengeance so complete and so appalling that it left Jason with nothing at all. A hollow man with a famous name and an empty life, exactly as she had been left hollow. And then she escaped. That's the part that made the Greeks so uneasy. She was not punished. She did not fall. She rose up in a chariot sent by her grandfather the sun, above the ruin she had made, beyond Jason's reach and beyond any earthly justice, and she flew away to a new life elsewhere, having done the unforgivable and gotten away clean. What do we do with Medea? The Greeks argued about her endlessly, and I don't think they ever settled it, and I don't think we have either. She is a victim, monstrously wronged, a woman who gave everything to a man who threw her away like a spent tool the moment a better opportunity came along. And she is a monster who committed acts that no grievance could ever justify. She is both at once, fully, without the story letting you off the hook by making her simply one or the other. She's what happens when you take a person of immense power and total devotion and you betray them completely, and the story refuses to tell you whether to weep for her or recoil from her, because the honest answer is both. The detail I keep returning to is how ordinary Jason's cruelty was compared to hers. Hers was operatic, mythic, unforgettable. His was mundane, the everyday betrayal of a man trading up, so common it barely registers as villainy. He didn't think he was doing anything monstrous. He thought he was being practical. And the story seems to be asking, quietly, underneath all the horror, which of those two things is actually worse? The spectacular vengeance, or the casual betrayal that summoned it? It doesn't answer. It just flies Medea away in her sun chariot and leaves you sitting there with the question. The girl who buried her brother after Medea, whose defiance destroyed everyone including herself. Here is a gentler kind of defiance, a young woman who broke the law not out of vengeance, but out of love, knowing exactly what it would cost her, and paid it with a quiet dignity that has made her a symbol of conscience ever since. Her name was Antigone, and she came, of course, from another cursed house, the royal family of Thebes, which had troubles nearly the equal of the house of Atreus. Her father had been a great king brought down by a terrible fate not of his own choosing, and after his fall the family continued to unravel, and it came down to Antigone's two brothers, who ended up on opposite sides of a war for control of the city. The two brothers met in the fighting, and both of them fell, each at the other's hand, so that the city was saved, but the royal brothers were both gone in a single day. Their uncle, a man named Creon, took the throne of Thebes in the aftermath, and he made a decree. One of the brothers, the one who had defended the city, would be honoured with a proper burial and all the sacred rites the dead were owed. But the other brother, the one who had attacked the city, would be treated as a traitor. His body would be left outside the walls, unburied, denied all rights, forbidden to anyone on pain of the harshest penalty. To the Greeks, this was not a small thing. Proper burial was a sacred duty, essential for the soul to find rest in the afterlife. To leave someone unburied was to condemn their spirit to a kind of limbo, and to forbid their family from performing the rites was to force them to abandon their own to that fate. Antigone could not do it. This was her brother. Whatever he had done in the war, whatever side he had chosen, he was her brother, and the sacred obligation to see him properly laid to rest was to her older and higher than any decree a king might issue. Creon's law said one thing. The law of the gods and of family and of basic human decency, as she understood it, said another. And when those two laws conflicted, Antigone knew which one she would follow, even though following it meant defying the king openly, even though the penalty was her own life. She went out, alone, and performed the rites for her brother. She scattered the ritual dust over him, gave him the symbolic burial the law forbade, honoured the sacred duty she believed no earthly ruler had the right to override. And she was caught, because of course she was caught, and brought before Creon, and she did not deny it. She stood in front of the king who held her life in his hands, and told him plainly that yes, she had done it, and yes, she had known his law, and that his law did not outrank the unwritten laws that came from something higher than any throne. She would rather face the consequence than leave her brother's spirit to wander, dishonoured, forever. Creon was not moved. He was a new ruler, insecure in his power, and here was a young woman, his own niece, defying him publicly and refusing to bend, and he could not afford to let it stand. His authority was at stake, and he chose his authority over mercy, over family, over the warnings of everyone around him who begged him to reconsider. He condemned her. She was to be sealed away, shut inside a stone chamber and left there, removed from the world of the living without technically having her life taken by his hand. A piece of legal cowardice that fooled no one. And Antigone went to her fate without begging, without recanting, mourning only that she would go to it young and unwed, having never lived a full life, but never once doubting that she had done the right thing. She had chosen conscience over survival with her eyes open, and she did not flinch from the price. The tragedy compounds from there, as these things do. Creon's own son was betrothed to Antigone, and loved her, and pleaded with his father to spare her, and when his father refused and it was too late, the young man could not bear the loss, and his own life ended in grief. And Creon's wife, learning that she had lost her son, could not bear that either, and her life ended too. And Creon, who had chosen his authority over his family, was left standing amid the ruin of that choice, having kept his precious law and lost everyone he loved to it, a king alone in an empty palace, understanding far too late that he had been catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. That's the real engine of Antigone's story, and it's why people have argued about it for thousands of years. It's not a simple tale of a brave girl and a wicked king. It's a collision between two things that both have a real claim, the authority of the state and the law of individual conscience, and the Greeks staged that collision without fully taking sides, letting you feel the weight of both. Creon isn't wrong that a state needs laws and that a ruler can't let everyone decide for themselves which laws to obey. Antigone isn't wrong that some obligations run deeper than any government's decree. They're both right, partially, and that partial rightness on both sides is exactly why it ends in catastrophe. because two partial rights colliding at full speed leave wreckage. But if the story has a heart, it beats on Antigone's side, because across thousands of years, it's her we remember, the young woman who looked at an unjust law and a sacred duty and chose the duty, knowing it would cost her everything, and did it without drama or self-pity, simply because it was right. She's become the patron figure of every person who ever defied an unjust order out of conscience, every individual who stood against the power of the state because something in them said this far and no further. She lost her life for a handful of ritual dust scattered over a brother the king had condemned. And she has been winning the argument, quietly, in the hearts of everyone who hears her story ever since. The man who solved the riddle we keep mentioning, Antigone's father, the great king brought low by a fate he never chose. So let's finally sit with him, because his is perhaps the most famous tragic story in all of Western literature, and its horror is entirely in its structure, in the way a man runs as hard as he can from a prophecy and runs directly into it precisely because he ran. His name was Oedipus, and before he was anything else he was a prophecy, spoken over him before he was even born. His parents, the king and queen of Thebes, were told something dreadful about the child the queen was carrying. This son, the oracle warned, would one day bring ruin to his own father, and would come to occupy his father's place in a way that violated the deepest laws of nature and family. It was the kind of prophecy that poisons a family before the child even arrives. And so his parents did the thing that people in these stories always do, the thing that never works. They tried to escape the prophecy by acting on it. Rather than raise the child and risk the foretold disaster, they gave the infant to a servant with instructions to leave him exposed on a mountainside, far from the city, to let the wilderness take him. They pinned his little feet together to be sure, and they told themselves the danger was past, that by removing the child they had removed the prophecy, that they had outwitted fate. They had not, of course. You cannot outwit fate in these stories. That's the entire lesson, told over and over. The servant, unable to go through with abandoning a helpless infant, passed the baby to a shepherd from a neighbouring kingdom, who passed him to a childless royal couple there, who raised him as their own beloved son. Oedipus grew up a prince, healthy and loved, believing the king and queen who raised him were his true parents, knowing nothing of the mountainside or the pinned feet or the words spoken over his birth. And then, a grown young man, he heard a rumour that he was not truly his parents' son, and troubled by it he went to consult an oracle himself, to ask about his origins. And the oracle did not answer the question he asked. Instead it told him the prophecy, the same terrible one from before his birth, that he was fated to bring ruin to his father and to take his father's place in the forbidden way. And Oedipus, horrified, loving the parents he believed were his, resolved to make absolutely sure it could never happen. He would never go home. He would flee the kingdom, put an ocean of distance between himself and the mother and father he loved, and by never returning he would make the prophecy impossible. Do you see the trap closing? He was running from the wrong parents. The people he was protecting weren't his parents at all, and the road he took to flee them led him, step by inevitable step, straight toward the ones who were. On that road, at a narrow crossroads, he met an older traveller, a proud man in a chariot with his attendants, and there was a dispute over who had the right of way. the kind of petty roadside quarrel that flares up between strangers over nothing. It escalated. Tempers rose, blows were exchanged, and in the violence of the moment Oedipus prevailed over the older man and his companions, and the older traveller's life ended there at the crossroads, at the hands of the young stranger. Oedipus thought nothing of it beyond the shock of a roadside brawl gone wrong. He did not know who the older man had been. He walked on. He came in time to the city of Thebes, which he found in the grip of a terror. A monstrous creature had settled outside the city, a being with the face of a woman and the body of a lion and great wings, and it was strangling the city, allowing no one to pass in or out unless they could answer its riddle, and no one could answer its riddle, and so the city was slowly being choked. Oedipus, clever and fearless, confronted the creature and heard its famous riddle, the one about what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at midday, and 3 in the evening. And he solved it. The answer was a human being, crawling as an infant, walking upright in the prime of life, leaning on a staff in old age. And the creature, defeated at last by someone who could answer, was undone, and the city was freed. Thebes was overjoyed. They had lost their king recently, it happened, to a violent encounter on the road, and here was a brilliant young stranger who had just saved them all. They made him their new king, and gave him the recently widowed queen as his wife, and Oedipus settled into a long and prosperous reign, ruling wisely, raising children, beloved by his people. Believing he had left his terrible prophecy far behind him in another country. You already know. You've known for several minutes, the way the audience always knows before Oedipus does, which is the specific engine of the horror. The older man at the crossroads had been the king of Thebes, had been Oedipus's true father. The widowed queen he married was his true mother. Every single thing the prophecy foretold had come to pass, precisely. And it had come to pass because of his efforts to avoid it, not in spite of them. Had he never fled the parents he thought were his, he'd never have taken that road, never met that traveller, never come to that city. His flight from the prophecy was the vehicle that delivered him into it. He built his own doom, brick by brick, out of his own desperate goodness. And it all came out, years later, slowly, terribly, as a plague settled on the city and the search for its cause led inexorably back to the truth of who Oedipus was and what he had unknowingly done. He investigated it himself relentlessly, as king, demanding the truth, brushing aside every warning to stop, every plea to leave it buried, hunting down his own identity with the same fierce cleverness that had solved the riddle. And the answer he uncovered was himself. He was the cause. He was the pollution on the city. The murderer he was hunting was the hunter. When the full truth stood revealed, his wife and mother could not survive the knowing of it, and her life ended by her own hand. And Oedipus, in his anguish and his shame at seeing at last what he had never been able to see, what had been in front of him his entire life, took his mother's brooch pins and put out his own eyes, choosing blindness, so that he would never look upon the ruin he had made, so that the man who had seen the answer to every riddle but the one that mattered would see nothing ever again. He was led out of the city, blind in exile, a broken king guided by his faithful daughter, that same Antigone we met before, who tended him in his wandering old age. And that is the fate that had loomed over the family before Antigone was ever born, the fate she inherited, the cursed house she came from. What makes Oedipus land so hard across so many centuries is that he did nothing wrong in the ordinary sense. He wasn't proud like Niobe or cruel like Tantalus. He was, if anything, trying to be good. He fled to protect the people he loved. He solved the riddle and saved a city. He hunted the truth as a responsible king should. Every choice he made was reasonable, even admirable. And every choice carried him deeper into the disaster, because the disaster had been set in place before he could choose anything at all. And his choices were the very steps of the dance that fate had already written. The Greeks were staring at the hardest question there is, whether we are free or whether the shape of our life is set before we begin. And in Oedipus they gave that question its most unbearable form. A good man, doing his best, walking with careful steps directly into the one pit he spent his whole life trying to avoid, and digging it himself with every stride. The water carriers who never fill the jar. Let's return to the underworld for a moment, to the great hall of eternal punishments, where Tantalus stands in his pool and Sisyphus rolls his stone, because there is another group down there, less famous but just as endlessly occupied, and their story is quietly one of the saddest in the whole catalogue. They were called the Danaids, and there were 50 of them, 50 sisters, the daughters of a king named Danaids, and their doom began, as so many do, with a marriage that should never have happened. Danaids had a brother, and the brother had 50 sons, and the brother proposed that the two sets of cousins marry, the 50 sons to the 50 daughters, a mass wedding to unite the family. But there was bad blood and mistrust between the brothers, and Danaids feared the marriage was a trap, a way for his brother's sons to gain power over him and his daughters. He did not want the wedding. He fled with his 50 daughters across the sea to escape it. But the 50 sons pursued them, and would not be refused, and eventually Danaids and his daughters were cornered into the marriage they had fled. The 50 weddings went ahead, and Danaids, still convinced the whole thing was a trap, and unwilling to lose his daughters or his power, gave his 50 daughters a terrible secret instruction on their wedding night. Each of them was to end her new husband's life while he slept. 49 of them obeyed. Only one, a young woman named Hypermnestra, could not do it. She had married a husband who had treated her gently, with respect, and she found she could not raise her hand against him, and so she spared him and helped him escape instead, defying her father out of love and conscience, the way Antigone would later defy a king. Her story branches off into something happier, a marriage that survived, a line that continued. But her 49 sisters had done what their father asked, and for that, when their own lives eventually ended and they passed down into the underworld, a punishment was waiting for them. They were given a task, and the task was this. They were to carry water and fill a great vessel, a large basin or jar, and keep it full. A simple domestic chore, the kind of thing they might have done any day in life. Except that the vessel they were given to fill was riddled with holes, or was a leaking, bottomless thing that could never hold water at all. So the water they poured in ran straight out, and they were condemned to keep carrying it anyway, forever, hauling water in jars to pour into a container that emptied as fast as they filled it, labouring endlessly at a task that could never, by its very design, be completed. It's the same terrible logic as Sisyphus and his stone, effort without result. Work that produces nothing and never ends, but there's a particular flavour to the Danaids version that gets under the skin. Theirs is domestic, it's chores. It's the endless, invisible, never-finished labour of keeping a household running, water carried and carried and carried, the vessel never staying full, the work never staying done. Anyone who has ever felt that a certain kind of labour is never truly finished, that you complete it only to find it needs doing again, and again, and again, has felt a small mortal echo of the Danaids at their leaking jar. There is something almost unbearably recognisable in a punishment that is just housework that never ends. And underneath the punishment is a sadder story still, which is that most of these women were not really villains. They were daughters, obeying a father, caught in a family feud they didn't start, married against their will to men who had pursued them across the sea, and told by the one authority they had ever known to do a terrible thing. 49 of them did as they were told. One of them refused, and it's the one who refused that the story ultimately honours, the same way it honours Antigone, the same lesson threading through again, that there are commands a person should not obey, even from a father, even from a king, and that the whole moral weight of a story can come to rest on the single figure who says no. But the 49 who said yes are still down there, filling the jar that will not fill, carrying water into a vessel that pours it back out onto the ground of the underworld, forever 50 sisters, one saved by mercy and 49 condemned by obedience. And the leaking jar between them like a lesson no one down there will ever get to learn. The wanderer who was turned into a cow, not every tale of divine attention ends in the underworld. Some of them just end in exhaustion, in a person driven across the entire known world by forces far above them, and one of the weariest of all these wanderings belonged to a young woman named Io, whose only crime was catching the eye of the wrong god. Io was a priestess, and she was beautiful, and Zeus, king of the gods, noticed her. This was, throughout mythology, never good news for the person being noticed. Zeus's attention fell on a great many mortal women across these stories, and it brought almost none of them anything but grief. Because Zeus was married, and his wife Hera was watchful and jealous and possessed of a very long memory and a very inventive capacity for revenge, and it was almost always the mortal woman, never Zeus, who ended up paying for his wandering eye. Zeus began pursuing Io, and to hide what he was doing from his wife, he covered the whole region in a thick cloud, a dense concealing darkness in the middle of the day, so that Hera up on Olympus wouldn't see what he was up to underneath it. But Hera was no fool, and a mysterious cloud appearing from nowhere and blanketing one specific patch of earth in daytime was exactly the sort of thing that made her suspicious, and she came down to investigate. And Zeus, caught panicking, did the only thing he could think of to hide the evidence. He transformed Io on the spot into a cow, a white heifer, so that when Hera arrived there would be no mortal woman to be found, just an innocent cow standing in a field. Hera was not fooled for a moment, but she played along, because playing along let her win. She admired the lovely white heifer and asked her husband sweetly if she might have it as a gift. And Zeus, trapped by his own lie, unable to refuse without admitting everything, had to hand over the cow that was really Io to his suspicious wife. Hera took possession of her rival, still in the form of a cow, and set a guard over her, a creature with 100 eyes, so that Io could never be rescued or restored, watched at every moment from every angle, because 100-eyed guardian never fully sleeps. Zeus, feeling some responsibility for the poor woman's plight, sent a clever god to free her, and this god managed to lull the 100-eyed guardian into sleep with endless soft talk and music, closing all 100 eyes at last and freed Io. But Hera, robbed of her guard, was not finished. She sent a torment after Io in her cow form, a maddening, stinging affliction that would give her no rest, that drove her to run and keep running, unable to stop, unable to settle, chased across the whole world by a torment she could not escape, because it followed her wherever she went. And so Io ran. She ran across countries and continents, a lone white cow driven half mad by relentless torment, crossing mountains and rivers and seas, wandering through the entire known world in her exhausted misery. Whole geographic features were said to be named for her passage. A strait of water she swam across, still carrying a version of her name. She went on, no home, no rest, no relief, a young woman trapped in an animal's body, hounded across the earth for the crime of having been beautiful in front of the wrong god. It's a strange, sprawling, sad odyssey, and what stays with you is the sheer injustice of the ratio. Zeus did the pursuing, Zeus told the lie, Zeus caused every bit of it, and Zeus paid nothing. He remained the king of the gods, untroubled, already turning his attention elsewhere. It was Io, entirely blameless, who was turned into an animal, handed to a jealous enemy, watched by 100 eyes, and then driven in torment across the whole face of the world. The powerful acted, and the powerless suffered for it. And that imbalance sits at the heart of so many of these stories that the Greeks must have felt it as a basic truth about the world they lived in. Her wandering did eventually end, far away, in a distant land, where Zeus at last restored her to her true form with a gentle touch, and she was able to live as a woman again and continue her line, from which, generations later, great heroes would descend. So it wasn't endless, the way Sisyphus is endless. There was a far shore to her exhaustion, but she had to cross the entire world to reach it, hounded every step in the body of a beast for something that was never her fault at all. And the god who did it to her felt, as far as we can tell, no more than a passing twinge of guilt on his way to his next mortal infatuation. The two who loved through a wall. Let's set the gods aside for a little while, because not all of these sorrows were handed down from Olympus. Some of them were just people, ordinary young people, undone by human stubbornness and terrible timing, and one of the oldest and most tender of these is the story of two young lovers who lived next door to each other and were never allowed to be together. Their names were Pyramus and Thisbe, and they lived in adjoining houses in the ancient city of Babylon, having grown up side by side, and somewhere along the way the childhood closeness had ripened into love. They wanted to marry. But their families, for reasons the story never fully bothers to explain because such reasons never really make sense, forbade it. The two households were set against the match, and the young lovers were kept apart, not allowed to see each other, forbidden to be together, held apart by the old and pointless grievances of their parents. But the houses shared a wall, and in that shared wall, over time, the lovers discovered a small crack, a thin fault in the stonework that ran between their two homes, a flaw that no one else had noticed. And through that crack they could talk. They pressed close to the wall on their separate sides and murmured to each other through the narrow gap, sharing everything they could not share in person, their love passing back and forth through a hair-thin opening in the stone. They complained gently to the wall itself, grateful that it let their voices through and resentful that it stood between them at all, so close that they could hear each other breathe, so divided that they could never touch. Day after day they met at the crack in the wall and loved each other through it, unable to do anything more than send words through a gap too narrow for a fingertip. At last they could not bear it any longer, and they made a plan to escape. They agreed to slip away from their homes that night, one at a time, and meet outside the city, at a particular spot marked by a tall mulberry tree beside a cool spring, and from there to run away together and finally be married, far from the families that had kept them apart. Thisbe reached the meeting place first. She came in the darkness to the mulberry tree by the spring and settled down to wait for Pyramus. But before he arrived, a wild lioness came to the spring to drink, fresh from a hunt, and Thisbe, seeing the dangerous animal in the moonlight, fled in fear to hide among some nearby rocks. As she ran, her veil slipped from her and fell to the ground, and the lioness, finding the dropped veil, toyed with it and marked it with the traces of her recent hunt before wandering back off into the night, leaving the veil torn and stained behind her at the foot of the tree. And then Pyramus arrived. He came to the mulberry tree expecting to find Thisbe waiting, and instead he found her veil, torn and marked with what looked like the signs of a terrible end, and the tracks of a great beast in the earth all around it. And he drew the obvious, agonizing, wrong conclusion. He believed that Thisbe had come to the meeting place ahead of him and had been set upon by a wild animal and lost her life, that she had died waiting for him, that his own plan had led her to her end while he was too slow to save her. Overcome with grief and guilt, unable to imagine living in a world where his beloved had come to such an end because of their plan, Pyramus took his own life there beneath the mulberry tree, and his lifeblood ran out over the roots and up into the pale fruit of the tree. And then Thisbe crept back. She emerged from her hiding place among the rocks, the danger past, eager to tell Pyramus what a fright she'd had, and she returned to the mulberry tree to find her love there, but not as she had left the world. She found him fallen, his life ending, or ended, beside her torn veil, and she understood in an instant everything that had happened, the whole terrible misunderstanding. The veil, the beast that was never a threat to her at all, his conclusion, his despair. He had believed her gone, and had not wanted to live in that world, and now he truly was leaving it, and it was all because of a dropped veil and a lioness that had merely been thirsty. She could not bear to be left behind. She gathered him to her and spoke to him, and then took up the same blade and followed him out of the world, so that the two of them who had never been allowed to be together in life would at least not be parted at the end, joined at last beneath the mulberry tree that their families had never permitted them to reach together. And the tree, the old story says, was changed by what happened beneath it. The mulberry, whose fruit had been pale, drank up the sorrow at its roots, and ever after its berries ripened to a deep dark red, so that the tree itself would carry the memory of the two young lovers forever. Its fruit stained the colour of a love that the world would not allow. That is why mulberries are dark, the story says. The tree is still mourning them. If this story sounds familiar in its bones, that's because it echoed down through the centuries and became, in a much later age, the seed of the most famous love story in the English language. Two young lovers from feuding families. A plan gone wrong, a fatal misunderstanding, each believing the other lost and following them out of the world. The shape is the same because the sorrow is the same. The particular tragedy of two people kept apart by the pointless quarrels of others, undone at the very moment they reached for freedom, by nothing more than terrible timing and a mistaken conclusion drawn in the dark. They loved each other through a crack in a wall. They almost made it out, and in the end the only thing that ever truly united them was a mulberry tree and the dark colour of its fruit. the swimmer and the light in the tower. Here is another pair of lovers separated by something they couldn't cross, though this time it wasn't a wall but the sea itself, and the story is famous for the small nightly ritual that held their love together, right up until the night the ritual failed. She was called Hero, and she was a priestess who lived in a tower on one side of a narrow strait of water, a channel where two seas nearly meet, and only a stretch of dark water separates one shore from the other. And he was called Leander, a young man who lived on the opposite shore, across that strait. They had met at a festival and fallen deeply in love, but the water lay between them, and Hero, as a priestess, was bound to her tower and her duties and could not simply cross over to be with him. So they worked out a way. Each night, when it was safe, Hero would climb to the top of her tower and light a single lamp, and set it in the window facing the sea. And Leander, watching from the far shore for that small point of light to appear across the dark water, would strip off his clothes and slip into the strait and swim. He would swim the whole width of that channel in the darkness, alone in the cold water, guided by nothing but the tiny flame in Hero's window, keeping his eyes fixed on that one light as he crossed, using it as his beacon to steer by. And Hero would come down and meet him on her shore, and dry him, and warm him, and they would have the night together. And before dawn he would slip back into the water and swim home again to the far shore, so that no one would know, and they would wait for darkness to fall once more. Night after night he made that swim, across the strait and back, guided each time by the lamp she lit for him. It was dangerous, a long cold swim through open water in the dark, but love made it feel possible, and the light in the window made it navigable, and so their secret arrangement carried them through a whole summer of stolen nights, the priestess and her lamp and the young man swimming toward it through the black water. But summer does not last, and as the season turned toward autumn and then toward winter, the strait grew rougher, the water colder, the nights wilder, and the crossing that had been merely dangerous became something far worse. Leander kept making the swim anyway, because he could not bear to stop, because the light still appeared in the window and he could not leave it unanswered, and Hero, longing for him, kept lighting the lamp, both of them pushing their luck a little further into the dangerous season, telling themselves it would be all right one more time. And then came the night of the great storm. Hero lit her lamp as always and set it in the window, and Leander saw it across the water and went in, the way he always did, trusting the light. But the storm came up hard while he was in the strait, and the wind rose, and the waves grew huge and violent, and out in the middle of that dark heaving water the young swimmer was tossed and battered and driven off course, struggling to keep sight of the one light that was guiding him. And then the wind gusted through Hero's high window and snuffed the lamp out. The light went dark. And Leander, out in the middle of the storm black strait, lost his beacon. He had nothing to steer by any more, nothing to swim toward, no point of light in all that violent darkness to tell him which way the shore lay. He struggled on, blind now, exhausted, fighting the cold and the waves with no star to guide him. And the strait was too much for him that night, and somewhere out there in the dark water his strength gave out, and he did not reach either shore. Hero waited through the storm, frantic, relighting the lamp, watching the water, praying for him to appear on her rocks the way he always had. When dawn came and the storm had spent itself, she looked down from her tower at the calming sea, and she saw him below, carried by the waves to the foot of her tower at last, but not swimming, not alive, brought to her shore by the water the way he had always brought himself. He had reached her tower after all, just not the way either of them had wanted. And Hero could not survive the sight of it. Having lost the one she had lit the lamp for every night of that whole secret summer, having understood that her light had gone out at the very moment he needed it most, she could not go on. She let herself fall from the high tower into the sea below, into the same water that had taken him, so that the strait that had kept them apart in life would at least hold them both together at the end. What lingers about Hero and Leander is the light. That small lamp in the window, faithfully lit night after night, a tiny human flame set against a whole dark sea, one person telling another across the impossible water, "Here I am. Come to me, I'll guide you home." It worked for a whole summer. Love kept the light burning, and the light kept the swimmer alive. And for a while that was enough to defeat the sea itself. And then one gust of wind on one bad night put the light out, and everything the light had been holding up came down at once. The strait is still there, the water still runs between the two shores, and somewhere in the old imagination a lamp is still burning in a tower window, or trying to, against a wind that finally proved too strong. The man who was loved by the dawn. Not every tragedy in these stories is loud. Some of them are so quiet you could almost miss the horror inside them, and one of the gentlest and most unsettling is the tale of a mortal man loved by a goddess, who asked for the wrong gift on his behalf and doomed him to something far worse than an ordinary ending. The goddess was Eos, the goddess of the dawn, the rosy-fingered being who rose each morning at the edge of the world and opened the gates of the sky for the sun to come through. She brought the light every single day, ageless and radiant, one of the immortal powers of the world. And she fell in love with a mortal man, a prince of Troy named Tithonus, so beautiful that even a goddess of the dawn could not resist him. She took him up to live with her at the edge of the sky, and loved him, and could not bear the thought that he, being mortal, would one day grow old and pass away and leave her, while she went on forever, immortal and unchanging. So she went to Zeus and begged a gift for her beloved. She asked that Tithonus be made immortal, that he be granted eternal life, so that he would never pass away, so that she would never have to lose him. And Zeus granted it. Tithonus was made immortal. He would live forever. But Eos, in her love and her haste, had made a terrible mistake. She had asked for eternal life. She had forgotten to ask for eternal youth, and those, it turns out, are not the same thing at all. Tithonus could not die, but he could still grow old, and so he did. As the years passed, and then the decades, and then the centuries, the mortal man aged, exactly as mortals do, while the goddess beside him stayed forever young and radiant. His hair went grey and then white. His skin wrinkled and then withered. His strength failed. His body grew frail and bent and ancient, and then more ancient still, drying and shrinking and wasting away with age, and none of it could bring the release that age eventually brings to everyone else, because he had been made unable to reach that release. He simply grew older and older and older, with no end to it, aging forever without ever being allowed to stop. Eos, watching the man she loved shrivel and wither year after year while she stayed young, eventually could not bear to be near him in the way she once had. In some tellings she shut him away in a chamber, this endlessly aging thing that had once been her beautiful prince, and there he remained, babbling, feeble, ancient beyond ancient. A voice with barely a body left, unable to move, unable to end, just going on and on and on. And in the gentlest version of the story, taking pity on him at last, she transformed him into a cricket or a cicada, one of those small insects whose thin, dry, endless chirping you hear on summer nights, so that the voice that could never stop would at least have some small form to carry it. That thin sound in the grass on a warm evening, the story says, is Tithonus, still going, still unable to fall silent, ages upon ages after everyone who ever knew him as a man has been gone. It's a horror dressed as a love story, and the horror is a very particular and very modern one. Because Tithonus's fate is precisely the thing that so much of human effort has quietly chased for so long, the dream of never dying, of living forever, of defeating the one certainty that hangs over everyone. And the Greeks looked at that dream clearly and saw the flaw in it that the dreamers always miss. Living forever is only a blessing if you also stay young and whole. Life without end, but with the body still wearing out, still aging, still declining with no flaw to the decline, isn't a gift. It's the longest imaginable sentence. The Greeks understood that the natural ending everyone fears is also, in its way, a mercy, a release, a flaw beneath the decline, and that to remove it while leaving everything else in place would be the cruelest thing you could do to a person, not the kindest. Eos meant it as love. She loved him so much she couldn't stand to lose him, and so she reached for the one thing that would keep him, and in reaching for it she condemned him to a fate worse than the loss she was trying to prevent. She would have done better to love him for a single mortal lifetime and let him go at the end of it, whole and at peace, than to keep him forever as a withering endless thing shut away in a room. But she couldn't see that in time, the way none of us can quite see it, the way we all reach instinctively to keep what we love from ending, not understanding that the ending is sometimes the gift. And so the dawn still rises every morning, ageless and beautiful, opening the gates of the sky, and somewhere behind her in the old story a small dry voice goes on chirping in the grass, endlessly, the prince who was loved so much that he was never allowed to rest, the boy the west wind loved. Here is a shorter sorrow, a bright and sudden one, about a beautiful young man and a game that went wrong, and about how even a god's love couldn't protect the one he loved from a single unlucky moment. The young man was named Hyacinthus, a Spartan prince of extraordinary beauty, and he was beloved by the god Apollo, who we've already seen twice tonight in less tender moods. But here Apollo is simply in love, delighting in the young man's company, spending his days with him, the two of them roaming the countryside together, the god setting aside his divine business to be with the mortal he adored. It was, for a while, one of the few relationships in all these stories that seemed to bring only happiness, a god and a young man genuinely glad of each other, with no jealousy or curse hanging over it. But there was a jealousy, quietly, on the edge of the story. The west wind, a god of the breezes named Zephyrus, also loved Hyacinthus, and burned with envy watching the young man choose Apollo's company over his. The wind wanted the boy, and could not have him, and had to watch him laugh and play with a rival, and that resentment was building even as the two of them enjoyed their carefree days, though no one was paying it any mind. One day Apollo and Hyacinthus were playing together at a game of throwing the discus, the heavy round disc that athletes hurled for distance, a test of strength and skill. Apollo, a god, threw it with tremendous power, sending it soaring high and far into the sky, and Hyacinthus, delighted, eager, ran to catch it or to fetch it where it would fall, the way an excited young person runs toward a game they're enjoying. And as the discus came down, something went wrong. In some tellings it struck the ground and bounced up hard, in others the jealous west wind, seizing his moment, blew upon the flying disc and pushed it off its course, sending it swerving to strike the young man as he ran beneath it. Either way, the heavy discus came down upon Hyacinthus, and the blow was more than the young man's body could withstand, and he fell. Apollo rushed to him, this god who had power over healing and medicine, this being who could cure almost anything. And for once all his divine power was useless, because the injury was beyond even him to mend, and he had to kneel there and hold the beautiful young man he loved, and feel the life going out of him, unable to stop it, a god defeated by a single unlucky throw in a friendly game. He cradled him and grieved, and railed against his own helplessness, and could not bear that his beloved was slipping away over something so small, so accidental, so undeserved. And because he was a god, and could not undo the loss but could at least transform it, Apollo made something out of his grief. He would not let Hyacinthus simply vanish from the world. Where the young man's lifeblood fell upon the earth, Apollo caused a flower to spring up, a delicate blossom, and on its petals he marked the sounds of mourning, so that the flower itself would seem to carry a cry of grief, and he named it after his beloved, the hyacinth. And he declared that the young man would be remembered forever, that the flower would bloom every spring carrying his name and Apollo's sorrow, so that Hyacinthus, gone from the world as a person, would return to it every single year as something beautiful rising from the ground. It's one of the tenderer transformations in all these stories, and it belongs to a whole quiet family of them. These tales where a beloved young person is lost too soon, and a grieving god turns the loss into a flower, so that the earth itself will remember and the beauty won't be entirely gone. The Greeks seem to have found real comfort in that idea, that the ones taken too young might return each spring as blossoms, that the ground remembers them and gives them back for a little while every year when the world turns warm again. It's the softest way they had of saying that the young dead are not entirely lost, that they come back as the flowers, that every spring hillside is crowded with the ones who went before, blooming, and there is. Buried in the prettiness, that small hard grain the Greeks could never quite leave out. It wasn't fate that took Hyacinthus, or a curse or a punishment for pride. It was jealousy, the resentment of a third party who couldn't have what he wanted, turning a game into a tragedy out of pure envy. The west wind is still blowing, and every spring the flowers come up marked with mourning, bowing their heads on their stems, remembering a bright young man and a discus, and a beautiful day that turned, in an instant, into one of the loveliest sorrows the Greeks ever told. The beautiful one caught between two worlds. Let's stay with beauty and loss a little longer, because there is another young man whose story sits at the very heart of what the Greeks understood about how quickly loveliness fades, and whose fate divided him, quite literally, between the world above and the world below. His name was Adonis, and he was so beautiful that two goddesses fought over him, which is the kind of thing that only ever ends badly for the beautiful person in question. Even as an infant he was so lovely that Aphrodite, the goddess of love herself, was captivated by him and wanting to keep him safe, she hid him away in a chest and entrusted him to Persephone, the queen of the underworld, to look after in secret. But Persephone opened the chest and saw the child's beauty and was equally captivated, and when Aphrodite came to collect him, Persephone would not give him back. Both goddesses wanted him, the goddess of love from the bright world above and the queen of the dead from the dark world below, and neither would yield. The dispute went all the way up to Zeus, or in some tellings to a muse to settle, and the judgment handed down was a compromise, the kind of custody arrangement that satisfies no one. Adonis would spend part of the year above, in the world of the living, with Aphrodite, and he would spend part of the year below, in the underworld, with Persephone. He belonged fully to neither world. He would pass back and forth between the light and the dark, between the goddess of love and the queen of the dead, spending his existence divided between the world of the living and the world of those who were gone. He grew into a young man of astonishing beauty, and Aphrodite loved him dearly and worried over him, because he loved to hunt, and hunting was dangerous, and she had a goddess's foreknowledge that danger was circling him. She begged him to be careful, to hunt only the timid, harmless creatures, and to leave the fierce ones alone, to not take risks, because she could not bear to lose him. And Adonis, young and confident the way the young are, did not entirely listen. One day, out hunting, he roused a great wild boar, an enormous and dangerous beast, exactly the kind of quarry Aphrodite had begged him to avoid. And the boar turned on him, and was more than he could handle, and gored him, and the young man fell, his life running out of him into the earth, just as the goddess had feared. Aphrodite, hearing his cry or feeling the loss from afar, rushed to him, but she came too late to save him, and could only gather him up as the life left him, a goddess of love grieving over a beauty she had not been able to protect. Exactly the helplessness we just saw in Apollo over Hyacinthus, and like Apollo, she turned the grief into a flower. Where the young man's lifeblood touched the ground, Aphrodite caused a flower to bloom, the anemone, a delicate bright blossom, so that his beauty would return to the world each year. But the anemone is a fragile, short-lived flower, its petals easily scattered by the wind, blooming brilliantly and then falling quickly. And that was fitting, because it captured the very thing Adonis had come to represent. He was beauty that doesn't last. He was the loveliness of youth, brilliant and brief, gone almost as soon as it fully arrives, scattered by the first hard wind. The Greeks understood Adonis as something larger than one unlucky hunter. His yearly passage between the world above and the world below. The bright half of the year with the goddess of love and the dark half with the queen of the dead echoed the turning of the seasons themselves. The way the green world blooms and flourishes and then fades and goes down into the barren dark of winter, only to return again. Adonis was the beautiful thing that grows and dies and grows again. The yearly reminder that the loveliest things are often the briefest, that youth and beauty and the green of the world are all on loan, brilliant for a season, and then gone back down into the dark. Returning each spring, but never staying, never permanent, always passing through on their way to somewhere else. Women in the ancient world held festivals for him, planting quick-growing seeds in shallow soil that would sprout fast and wither faster, little gardens that lived brilliantly for a few days and then died, a deliberate ritual of watching beauty flourish and fade in miniature, mourning Adonis and mourning, through him, everything lovely that doesn't last. They understood something true and a little unbearable, which is that the brevity is part of the beauty, that a thing which bloomed forever wouldn't move us the way a thing that blooms and falls does, that we love the spring flowers partly because we know the wind is coming for them. Adonis is still passing back and forth, in the old imagination, half his existence in the light and half in the dark, belonging fully to neither. The most beautiful young man there ever was, spending eternity as a symbol of how quickly the most beautiful things move through the world and are gone. The sleeper who never woke. After so many violent and grief-torn fates, here is one that is almost peaceful, almost enviable, and yet contains a quiet sorrow all its own. The strange story of a young man who was granted eternal youth and beauty on one condition, which was that he would sleep through all of it, forever. His name was Endymion, and depending on which teller you ask, he was a shepherd or a young king or a hunter, but in every version he was extraordinarily beautiful, a young man of such loveliness that he caught the attention of the moon. The goddess of the moon, Selene, drove her silver chariot across the night sky the way the sun god drove his golden one across the day, and one night, looking down upon the sleeping earth, she saw Endymion where he lay, and fell in love with him completely, the cool distant moon in love with a sleeping mortal man. Night after night she would come down to gaze upon him, this beautiful young sleeper, and her love for him grew until she could not bear the thought of losing him, could not bear that he was mortal, and would age and fade and pass away like all mortals do, that his beauty would wither and be gone. She had watched perhaps what happens to mortal beauty over time. She wanted to keep him exactly as he was, young and lovely, forever. And so a bargain was struck, in the way these things are, with Zeus granting Endymion a wish. And the wish, in the most enduring version of the story, was this, that Endymion would be granted eternal youth and would never age and never pass away, preserved in his beauty forever, but that the price of this endless preservation was endless sleep. He would sleep perpetually, never waking, never aging, lying in a cave or on a mountainside in an unbroken slumber that would last as long as the world did. Forever young, forever beautiful, forever asleep. And so it was. Endymion lay down in his eternal sleep, and never woke, and never aged, preserved in the perfect bloom of his youth for all time. And the moon came to him every night, descending from her chariot to be with her sleeping love, gazing upon him, embracing him, loving him in his endless slumber, and then rising again before dawn to cross the sky, returning the next night, and the next, and the next, forever. Some versions say she bore him many daughters, this love conducted entirely in sleep. A whole family born to a father who never once woke to see it. She loved him for eternity, and he slept through every moment of it. It's a beautiful image, the sleeping youth on the moonlit mountainside and the moon goddess bending over him night after night. And it has inspired painters and poets for centuries precisely because it's so lovely and so still. But sit with it a moment longer, and the quiet sorrow rises to the surface. Because Endymion got the thing everyone thinks they want, the escape from aging, the preservation of youth and beauty forever, the defeat of the ending that comes for everyone. And the cost of it was that he was never awake for any of it. He was loved, deeply, eternally, by a goddess. And he never knew. He never saw her face bending over him. He never spoke to her, never held her while awake, never watched his own children grow, never experienced a single moment of the endless existence he'd been granted. He simply slept, beautiful and unconscious, while eternity and love and everything else passed over his sleeping form like moonlight. The Greeks were poking, gently, at the same nerve they pressed with Tithonus, the same warning wrapped in a different shape. There is no clean escape from the ending. You can defeat aging, but only by trading away wakefulness, by trading away the life itself. Tithonus kept his consciousness and lost his youth, aging horribly forever. Endymion kept his youth and lost his consciousness, sleeping beautifully forever. Both of them cheated the natural ending, and both of them, in cheating it, gave up the very thing that made existence worth having. You cannot keep the sweetness of life without also accepting that it ends. Try to remove the ending, and you find you've removed the life along with it, one way or another. And yet, of all the fates we've walked through tonight, Endymion's is the softest, the one that comes closest to something you could almost call rest. He isn't in torment. He isn't reaching for fruit that pulls away, or rolling a stone, or weeping himself to stone. He's asleep, and he's beautiful, and he's loved, and the moon comes to him every night, and if he never knows it, well, he also never suffers, never fears, never grieves, never feels the sharp edge of anything at all. There are worse eternities than a peaceful sleep on a moonlit mountain with someone who loves you keeping watch. Maybe that's why the image has lasted. It's the one doom in the whole catalogue that looks, from a certain angle, a little like peace. He's still up there sleeping, in the old story, and the moon still comes down every night to sit beside him. And the last thing I'll say about Endymion before we move on is that he is the only figure we've met tonight who is doing eternally the exact thing you are trying to do right now. The rider who reached for heaven. We've spent time with several young people who flew too high, so let's meet the grown man who did it most literally. A genuine hero who slew monsters and won glory, and then, at the peak of it all, decided that mortal fame wasn't enough, and aimed himself straight at the home of the gods. His name was Bellerophon, and he began as one of the great heroes, brave and capable, the kind of young man legends are built around. Early in his story he was falsely accused of a serious wrong by a woman whose advances he had honourably refused, and her husband, believing the lie but unwilling to harm a guest directly, sent Bellerophon off to a distant king carrying a sealed message. The message, unknown to Bellerophon, secretly instructed the distant king to do away with the young man. It's one of the oldest treacheries in storytelling, a person sent on a journey carrying, without knowing it, the instructions for their own undoing. The distant king, equally unwilling to harm a guest outright, chose instead to send Bellerophon on a task that was surely impossible to survive. He was to go and defeat a terrible monster that was ravaging the countryside, a creature called the Chimera, a nightmarish thing that was part lion, part goat, and part serpent, and breathed fire. No one had been able to stand against it. Sending a young man to fight it was simply a slower way of arranging his end. But Bellerophon had help. With the guidance of the gods and the gift of a golden bridle, he managed to capture and tame the most magnificent creature in all of mythology, the winged horse Pegasus, a stallion with great white wings that could carry its rider through the air. Mounted on Pegasus, able to attack the fire-breathing monster from above where it could not reach him, Bellerophon accomplished the impossible task. He defeated the Chimera, striking from the sky, and returned in triumph, alive when he was meant to be gone. The king, astonished, set him further impossible tasks, and Bellerophon on his winged horse accomplished every one of them. Enemy warriors, fierce tribes, every deadly challenge thrown at him, he overcame them all, until at last the king understood that this was no ordinary young man to be quietly disposed of, but a genuine hero favoured by the gods, and he gave up his plotting and honoured Bellerophon instead, gave him his daughter in marriage and a share of the kingdom. Bellerophon had come through the treachery and the impossible tasks, and out the other side into everything a hero could want: glory, a winged horse, a kingdom, a family. He had, by any reasonable measure, won, and that should have been the end of it, a rare happy ending in this catalogue of sorrows. But it wasn't, because Bellerophon could not leave well enough alone, and his fate turns entirely on that. Somewhere in all the triumph, something curdled in him. Having done so much, having flown so high and defeated so much, and risen so far above ordinary mortals, Bellerophon began to feel that he was more than mortal, that his deeds had earned him a place among the gods themselves. And he decided, in the end, that he would simply go there. He would mount Pegasus and fly up, all the way up, past the clouds and the heights that mortals were never meant to pass, and arrive at the home of the gods on the summit of Olympus, and take his place among the immortals as he felt he deserved. It was the oldest error in the whole tradition, the one the Greeks had a specific word for, the pride that forgets the line between mortal and divine and tries to cross it, and it never, ever went unanswered. As Bellerophon urged Pegasus higher and higher, climbing toward the forbidden heights of Olympus, Zeus saw the mortal presuming to fly up and join the gods, and was not going to allow it. He sent a small thing to stop a great one, a single gadfly, a biting insect sent to sting the winged horse, and Pegasus, stung, reared and bucked in the high air, and threw his rider, and Bellerophon fell, not to his end, in the fullest version, which is somehow worse. He survived the long fall, but he was broken by it, and worse than broken, he was disgraced, cast down from the very heights he'd reached for, humbled utterly. Pegasus flew on without him, up to Olympus, where the gods welcomed the magnificent horse, and gave it a place in the heavens. But Bellerophon, the rider, the hero, was left behind on the earth, lamed and shattered and shunned. And he spent the rest of his days wandering alone, avoiding the paths of other people, a hollow and broken figure eating out his own heart in grief and isolation, mourning the glory he'd had and thrown away by reaching for more than a mortal was allowed. That's the fate the Greeks reserved for him, and it's pointed. Bellerophon isn't punished for failing, he's punished for winning and then not being able to stop. He had everything, every gift the world could give a hero, and it wasn't enough, because he'd started to believe his own legend, started to think the rules that bind mortals no longer applied to him. And the fall wasn't just off a horse. It was the fall of a man from the summit of his own life, all the way down to a lonely old age, spent limping across empty country, remembering when he could fly. The horse got to keep the sky. The man did not. There's a whole sermon in that, if you want one, about the difference between a gift and the one it's given to, and about how the surest way to lose everything you've won is to decide you've earned the right to more than any person gets. Bellerophon flew higher than nearly anyone ever had, and it ruined him, because he couldn't accept that even the highest flying mortal is still, in the end, only mortal, and the summit of Olympus was never going to be his to land on. The musician who challenged a god. We met Arachne earlier, the weaver who dared to compete with the goddess and lost everything for winning. There was a musician who made the same mistake against the same family of gods, and his story is even more pointed about what happens when a mortal artist forgets exactly who they're measuring themselves against. His name was Marsyas, and he wasn't quite a man. He was a satyr, one of those wild half-human woodland creatures, and he found, one day, a remarkable instrument lying abandoned. It was a set of pipes, a double flute, and it had a strange history. The goddess Athena had invented it and learned to play it beautifully, but when she saw her own reflection while playing, and noticed how the effort of blowing into it puffed out and distorted her cheeks and face, she was so displeased by the unflattering look of it that she threw the instrument away in disgust and cursed whoever should pick it up. And Marsyas, wandering by, found the discarded pipes and picked them up, curse and all. He taught himself to play, and he became extraordinary at it. The pipes seemed almost enchanted, and Marsyas's skill grew until the music he made was breathtaking, and people who heard it began to praise him extravagantly, to say that no one could play more beautifully, that his music rivaled even that of the gods. And Marsyas, like so many talented mortals before him, let the praise go to his head. He came to believe he really was the finest musician alive, finer perhaps than the gods themselves, and in his pride he issued a challenge. He would compete against Apollo, the god of music, in a contest of skill, to settle once and for all who was the greater musician. You can already hear the trouble in it. We've seen exactly this shape twice tonight. A gifted mortal, drunk on praise, challenging a god of their own art to a direct contest. It did not end well for Arachne. It would not end well here. Apollo accepted the challenge, and the terms were set, and they were terrible. The winner of the contest could do whatever they wished to the loser. The two of them would play and be judged, and the victor would have absolute power over the vanquished. Marsyas, confident in his enchanted pipes and his genuine skill, agreed. They played, and it was close. That's the thing that makes it sting. Marsyas really was that good. His playing on the double pipes was so beautiful that the judges could not easily choose between the mortal satyr and the god, and the first round left them essentially even, unable to declare a clear winner. Marsyas had done the seemingly impossible, and matched a god of music note for note. So Apollo, unwilling to lose or even to tie, changed the terms mid-contest to something Marsyas could not match. He turned his lyre upside down and continued to play it beautifully even inverted, and challenged Marsyas to do the same with his pipes, to turn his instrument upside down and keep playing. But you cannot play a flute upside down. You cannot sing into it and finger it inverted the way you can a stringed instrument. The demand was impossible for the pipes by their very nature, and Marsyas could not do it, and so Apollo was declared the winner, having won not purely on beauty, but on a trick of the terms that the satyr's instrument couldn't answer. And then Apollo claimed his victor's prize, his absolute power over the loser, and what he did to Marsyas was one of the harshest punishments in all these stories, so we will keep it very soft. Apollo made an example of the satyr who had dared to challenge a god in a way that was public and terrible, and left no doubt about the gulf between mortal presumption and divine power. The creatures of the woods, the nymphs and the other satyrs, and all the wild things who had loved Marsyas's music, wept for him, and their tears, the old story says, gathered together and became a river. a clear stream that still runs in that region, named after Marsyas, so that his passing left a river of the grief of everyone who had loved his playing. The Greeks told this story with a real edge to it, and the edge cuts a particular way. It's not simply that Marsyas was punished for pride, though he was. It's that the contest itself was never fair, and everyone knew it. When a mortal challenges a god, the mortal has already lost, no matter how good they are, because the god can change the rules, can turn the instrument upside down, can move the line wherever they need it to be to win. Marsyas played beautifully enough to tie a god, and it didn't matter, because you cannot actually beat a god at anything, since the god is also the one keeping score. His real error wasn't a lack of skill, he had skill in abundance. His error was believing that skill could ever be enough against a power that also controlled the terms of the contest. And there's a sadness in it beyond the harshness, which is that Marsyas loved music. He wasn't cruel or greedy. He was an artist who got too proud, who let praise convince him he was more than he was, and reached for a contest he should have known better than to seek. The river that still bears his name is made of the tears of everyone who loved what he could do, and that's the part worth carrying away from it. He was genuinely gifted. The whole forest mourned him, and none of it saved him, because he forgot the one rule these stories teach over and over, which is that you do not measure yourself against the gods, no matter how good you are, because the measuring is theirs to control. The man bound to the turning wheel. There is one more figure in that great hall of eternal punishments in the underworld, alongside Tantalus and Sisyphus and the Danaids, and his crime was perhaps the most brazen of all of them, and his punishment the most dizzying, an endless turning that never stops. His name was Actaeon, and he was a king, and he began his career of wrongdoing in an ordinary enough way, with a broken promise and a betrayal over a marriage debt. He had agreed to pay a bride price for his wife, and when the time came to pay it, rather than honour his word to his new father-in-law, he arranged for the man to come to collect, and then treacherously did away with him instead, becoming the first person in the old stories to bring harm to a member of his own family by marriage. This was, to the Greeks, a horrifying pollution, the violation of the sacred bonds of kinship and hospitality, and it made Actaeon an outcast, so stained by what he'd done that no one on earth would perform the rites to cleanse him of it. He wandered, shunned, a man too polluted for ordinary society to touch. And then something remarkable happened. Zeus, of all beings, took pity on him. The king of the gods, moved by the wretchedness of this outcast, did the extraordinary thing of cleansing Actaeon of his pollution personally, and more than that, invited him up to Olympus to dine with the gods as a guest, to be restored and welcomed at the divine table. It was an act of tremendous mercy and honour, the same rare privilege that had been given to Tantalus at the very start of our night, a mortal welcome to eat among the immortals. And Actaeon, like Tantalus, repaid that extraordinary honour with an act of stunning ingratitude, because once he was up on Olympus, dining with the gods, restored and forgiven, Actaeon set his sights on Hera, the wife of the very god who had shown him such mercy. He began to lust after the queen of the gods, to pursue Zeus's own wife under Zeus's own roof, plotting to betray his host and benefactor in the most outrageous way imaginable. It was a breathtaking abuse of hospitality, a guest scheming against the honour of the host who had saved him, and it was aimed at the king of the gods himself. Zeus, learning of it, could scarcely believe it, and he set a test. He shaped a cloud into the likeness of Hera, a phantom double of his wife, and set it in Ixion's path to see whether the man would really go through with his treachery. And Ixion, deceived, embraced the cloud image, believing it was the queen of the gods, and so proved his guilt beyond any doubt, caught in the very act of betraying the god who had shown him mercy. From that strange union with the cloud, the old stories say, came a whole race of creatures. But that's a branch of the tale for another night. What matters is that Ixion was caught, exposed as a guest who had schemed against his host, an outcast who had been saved and forgiven and had answered that salvation by reaching for the one thing most forbidden to him. And Zeus's punishment was severe and final. Ixion was cast down from Olympus and bound to a great wheel, a fiery wheel that was set spinning and never stopped, turning through the air or through the underworld forever, with Ixion bound to it, spinning endlessly, around and around and around for all eternity, never able to rest, never able to get off. The world wheeling past him in a ceaseless, dizzying turn that would never, ever cease. In some tellings the wheel was wreathed in flame, in others it simply turned forever through the dark. Either way, the essence of it was the endless spinning, the perpetual motion that led nowhere, the eternal turning of a man who had abused the highest mercy ever shown to him. Ixion completes a kind of matched set with Tantalus, and the Greeks surely told them as a pair. Both were mortals granted the almost unheard-of privilege of dining with the gods as equals. Both repaid that honour with a monstrous violation, Tantalus testing the gods with his terrible meal, Ixion betraying his host's marriage. And both were punished with an eternity that perfectly answered their crime. Tantalus, who abused a feast, was given an eternal feast he could never eat. Ixion, whose life had spun out of control from one betrayal to the next, gathering momentum from broken promise to abused mercy to attempted treachery, was bound to a wheel and made to spin, out of control forever. The punishment is the crime made eternal, the same grim symmetry we keep meeting. But there's a particular lesson the Greeks tucked into Ixion that's worth pausing on as we near the end of our long night. It's about hospitality and gratitude and what you owe to the one who lifts you up when you're at your lowest. Ixion was an outcast, shunned by all the world, too stained even to be cleansed, and one being took pity on him and saved him and honoured him beyond anything he could have hoped for. And he answered that mercy by trying to take the one thing his benefactor held most dear. To the Greeks this was close to the worst thing a person could do, worse in its way than the original crime, because it betrayed not an enemy but a friend, not a stranger but the one who had shown you kindness when no one else would. The wheel turns forever, because ingratitude of that magnitude, the biting of the hand that saved you, was to them a kind of endless spinning wrongness that could never be allowed to come to rest. Around and around he goes, in the deep places, the man who was pulled out of the mud and set at the table of the gods, and who reached, even there, for what was not his. The wheel has not stopped. It was never going to stop. That was the whole point of the wheel. We've walked through a great many sorrows tonight, and before we let the night close over them, I want to sit for a moment with the question underneath all of them, which is why. Why did a people invent so many exquisite tragedies? Why fill your stories with reaching hands and turning wheels and weeping stone and lovers lost one step from the light? What were the Greeks doing, telling themselves these things generation after generation around their fires and in their theatres? They were not, I think, being cruel for the sake of it. Look back over the night and you can see a whole philosophy taking shape in the shadows, a way of understanding a world that must have seemed, to the people who lived in it, dangerously unpredictable and often unfair. Some of what we heard was warning, plainly, do not reach past your station. Do not challenge the gods, do not fly toward the sun, do not climb toward Olympus on a borrowed horse, do not measure your art against the divine, and expect the ordinary rules to hold. Icarus and Phaethon and Bellerophon and Marsyas and Arachne all learned the same lesson, that there is a line between mortal and more than mortal, and that crossing it, or even leaning too far across it, brings you down. To a people without much power over their own circumstances, ruled by forces they couldn't predict, these were lessons in humility, in staying low, in not drawing the attention of the powerful. But it wasn't all warning, because plenty of these people did nothing wrong at all. Actaeon took a wrong turn. Io was simply beautiful in the wrong company. Iphigenia trusted her father. Cassandra changed her mind about a bargain. Niobe loved her children and said so. These stories aren't teaching a lesson about behaviour, because good behaviour wouldn't have saved any of them. They're teaching something harder, which is that the world is not fair, that terrible things happen to people who did not earn them, that the powers governing existence are not moral in the way we wish they were, and that no amount of innocence guarantees safety. That's a bleak thing to tell yourself. But it's also, in its way, a kind of preparation, a steeling of the heart against a world where the undeserving suffer, so that when it happens to you or to someone you love, you are not also broken by the shock of its unfairness, having been told all your life that the world was sometimes simply like this. And underneath both the warnings and the hard truths, there is something tenderer still, which is grief itself, honoured and given shape. So many of these stories are really just containers for loss. A mother turned to weeping stone, a father flying on alone over the water where his son fell, a musician who almost brought his love back into the light, two young people who loved through a wall and never got to meet on the other side of it. The Greeks took the unbearable fact of loss, the plain reality that people we love are taken from us, often too soon and for no good reason, and they gave it stories to live in. They turned grief into weeping rock and dark mulberries and spring flowers marked with mourning, so that the loss would have somewhere to go, some shape to hold, some way of being carried that wasn't just raw and formless pain. When you point to a rock on a mountain and say that is a grieving mother, or to a red-berried tree and say those are lovers who couldn't be together, you have done something with your sorrow. You have set it into the world, made it part of the landscape, made it bearable by making it beautiful. That's the thing I keep coming back to, the transformations especially. Notice how often these stories end, not with an ending, but with a becoming. Niobe becomes stone that still weeps. Arachne becomes the spider still weaving, the flowers, the rivers of tears, the amber, the dark fruit, Echo becoming the voice in the empty valley, Tithonus becoming the small dry sound in the summer grass. The Greeks could not bear quite to let their beloved dead simply vanish, and so they wrote them into the permanent things, the rocks and the rivers and the flowers and the sounds of the natural world, so that grief would become part of the world's furniture, always present, always there to be noticed, but softened into something that no longer had the power to break you. The stone doesn't feel the arrows anymore, it only remembers. And I think that's the gentlest and wisest thing they did, and the reason these stories have outlasted the people who first told them by thousands of years. They understood that we cannot escape loss, that reaching for immortality gets you Tithonus withering forever or Endymion asleep through his own existence, that there is no way out of the fact that things end. But they also understood that we can transform loss, that we can take the unbearable and set it into something that endures and even consoles, that a grief given beautiful form becomes something a person can live alongside. That's what a story is, in the end. It's a way of carrying what would otherwise be too heavy to hold. So here we are, at the bottom of the long night, among all of them. Tantalus still reaching for the fruit that lifts away, and the water that drains before he can drink. Sisyphus walking back down the hill toward his stone, again forever. Prometheus on his crag, and the eagle, and the dawn that keeps coming. Niobe weeping on her mountain, the rock still damp in the mornings. Orpheus, who turned around one step from the light and lost her a second time. Icarus on the water and his father flying on alone above him. All the reaching hands, all the turning wheels, all the ones who loved too much or reached too high, or simply took a wrong turn on a beautiful morning and paid for it with everything. They were not real, most of them, and yet they were, because the people who told these stories were real, and their griefs were real, and every reaching hand and weeping stone was a way of holding something true about being alive in a world that gives you everything you love and then, sooner or later, asks for it back. The Greeks looked straight at the hardest facts of existence, the unfairness and the loss and the ending that comes for everyone. And instead of looking away, they made these aching, beautiful, sorrowful stories so that no one would have to face those facts alone or without words for them. Every person who ever lost someone too soon and told the story of Orpheus felt a little less alone in it. Every parent who ever feared for a reckless child and thought of Icarus understood their fear a little better. The stories were a gift, passed hand to hand down 30 centuries, from people long gone to you, lying here in the dark tonight. And that's the thing to carry down into sleep with you. Not the sorrow, though the sorrow is real, the tenderness underneath it. The fact that human beings, thousands of years ago, cared enough about the people they lost and the fears they carried to turn all of it into something this beautiful, so that it could be handed forward, so that on some quiet night in the far future, a person they could never have imagined could lie in the dark and be kept company by their weeping stones and their spring flowers and their lovers reaching through walls. That's a kind of immortality the Greeks would have recognized. Not the endless withering of Tithonus, but this to be remembered, gently, by someone who never knew you, long after you yourself have gone down into the dark. The ones who came before are still speaking. And we're still listening. The fruit still lifts away. The stone still rolls back down. And up on his moonlit mountainside, Endymion is still sleeping, beautiful and untroubled, the moon keeping watch over him the way sleep is about to keep watch over you. So let your eyes close now, if they haven't already. Let the reaching hands rest. Let the wheel slow and the stone lie still, and the whole long catalogue of sorrows settle into the quiet, where they can't trouble anyone anymore. You've kept company with the doomed and the grieving and the transformed, and you honoured them just by listening, and now you can set them down. Rest well, sleep gently, and good night.